Or else, famously, it was later discovered in the during the 2016 presidential election in the US, Russian-sponsored posts have reached about 126 million American users on Facebook only. And these are just two prominent examples. There are, of course, many more cases. So in addition to these kind of two domestic and international dynamics, several developing countries that aspire to replicate the Chinese and Russian models of AI-empowered state control are extensively buying these kinds of technologies from them, and they're using it and experimenting with them on their populations, sometimes with little to no space for civil society to push back. So our panel today is going to ask what then can be done to fight these threats and how we can pull resources together from various sectors, tech, policy, research and civil society in order to safeguard democracy and rebuild trust in this rapidly evolving digital landscape. Addressing these important issues with me this morning are first Carl-Henrik Knudsen, who is a professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo, and he's also a research professor at PRIO. He leads several research projects on various aspects of autocratic politics and democratic resilience, including the intersections between politics and digital and social media. Then we have Morten Langfeldt Dalbakk, who is the head of innovation and technology at Faktisk, and he works with fact-checking and artificial intelligence. He's also part of the management of the Nordic Observatory for Digital Media and Information Disorder, Nordis, a consortium of researchers and fact-checkers from the Nordics, which aims to develop practices and models that can help counteract harmful information online. And then to my immediate right, last but not least, PRIO's own Christopher Liden, who's a research director at PRIO, and who works on ethics with a focus on the fields of peace building, peacemaking, humanitarian action, security and digital technologies, including, for example, researching how AI tools are reshaping the humanitarian sector, the nexus between digital practice, technological development, and human interaction, and disruptive digital technologies. So thank you all for agreeing to take part in this panel. There will be time for Q&As at the end. But first, let me start off with a question for Carl and ask you, how have autocracies around the world been exploiting the opportunities presented by AI tools to enhance their powers and spread propaganda, misinformation, and fake news?
Thank you, Ilaria. And I should also note that I'm also recovering. Should probably been at home recovering, hence the mask. So that's kind of off the table. Thank you for the question and for inviting me. I think it's in terms of the extent of use, as you noted, it's a rapidly evolving empirical landscape. And I think you also noted several of the most important examples, from facial recognition to the spread of misinformation, kind of bots, and also perhaps increasingly generative AI, so deepfake videos and so on. So there's a vast variety of different tools. So I just kind of panic read up on the Freedom of the Net report from Freedom House yesterday to get some examples, and they noted in last year at least 16 examples of generative AI use related to, I think mainly to election campaigns, but the spread of misinformation. But this is kind of probably an undercount. So the examples are pretty kind of diverse, and we can get back to some of them. I think kind of maybe the most kind of prominent ones, kind of Russian bot networks, but also kind of the facial recognition technology in China, and how they're kind of connecting that to collecting information on citizens are kind of super prominent. And of course, instances of deepfake videos that try to kind of tilt information space during kind of very sensitive election times, because most autocracies also hold elections, and this is kind of, but they're not free and fair. So anything that can basically alter the chances of the incumbent winning, that's important. But I think kind of taking one step back, and this goes for different types of technologies, information technologies and others. And if you take it at a more abstract level, autocracies use kind of several sets of strategies for retaining power. So one is kind of basic repression, kind of threats that could be physical, actual repression, or threats of taking away something from citizens who object to the regime. It's kind of taking away your kids' university space, or kind of ability to study at the university or job, and so on, kind of imposing costs. Then you have more co-optation, so basically doling out some kind of favors or benefit to some kind of potential allies in order to secure that they're loyal towards the regime. And then you have more legitimation strategies. So basically, rather than doling out any material benefits, so money or different perks or even a slot in parliament, you try to go in and kind of alter how citizens and elite groups perceive the regime. So you're basically saying, well, kind of it's legitimate that they rule despite the lack of free and fair elections. And what is critical for all these strategies is kind of accurate information. So both kind of obtaining information, but also controlling the information space. And especially when it comes to repression and cooptation, the more targeted you can be, the better. So there's a lot of work, for example, on the potential for backlash if you go out and just shoot a bunch of citizens or throw kind of everyone who is protesting in jail. The more targeted you can be and try to kind of pinpoint exactly where the most important threats are, remove leaders who organize collective action and so on, the better for an autocratic regime. And in this regard, anything that can kind of help you both obtain and process a lot of information very, very quickly. And this is kind of one area where AI can be super beneficial, right? In terms of kind of just processing amounts of information, that's super helpful. The same goes with cooptation, knowing exactly where you should kind of dole out the goods and make concessions. And then kind of finally, in terms of legitimation, kind of anything that helps you kind of control the information space, spread the information that's to your advantage, and make sure that it goes to the right groups of people, again, targeting. So I think this is one of the areas where I think AI is really important, but I'll stop there, and I guess we'll come back to some of the more specific things.
Yeah, thank you for this introduction. Of course, for somebody like myself who works on China, this is all very familiar, you know, the kind of what you mentioned about the necessity of like control of information. And China has been one of the most active authoritarian regimes to really, I mean, in many ways, as you pointed out, these techniques are not really new, but the tools that are used are new. And China has been actively embracing, right, these various AI tools to like strengthen and empower their kind of control techniques even more.
If I could add one point,
Sure.
Which I'm glad you're mentioning. So in a sense, China and also Russia, these are authoritarian or autocratic regimes with a lot of resources. And in a sense, you can see how they develop technology. They spread and diffuse technology, as you note. But to some extent, I mean, to the extent that AI, it's a lot cheaper if you can kind of write a program than have a large troll farm or have a lot of people monitoring the internet physically. These are things that Russia and China can do and have done. So to that extent, if you're making some of these strategies for obtaining and processing information cheaper, some of the main beneficiaries down the line might be autocratic regimes with less resources, who can kind of learn, adapt, and make use of some of these important strategies on the cheap. So that's actually what I would be interested in seeing, how this spreads in the coming years.
Yeah, and again, as I said, I also partly work on the issue of developing countries acquiring these technologies. So I'm sure that we will return to this during our conversation. So picking up on this, I would like to ask Morten, because of course, if you've read assessments by the Norwegian Armed Forces, the intelligence service, you would see that Russia, China, and then Iran are identified as number 1, 2, 3 threats to Norway, including a lot of online influence operations. So, and of course, you work with fighting disinformation on a daily basis. So I wanted to ask you if you can give us the perspective from the practitioner's side. How do you work every day to fact check and counter this fake news? And how do you use AI tools to do that?
Sure. So I think it's just for context, we're a newsroom, so we work in different ways from intelligence agencies and the armed forces for obvious reasons. We're a journalistic operation. So what we do essentially is that we every day our journalists and our editors, they try to collect sort of the most important things that are happening in the news, from tips, from social media, from just normal media surveillance, trying to pick up on, is there something that is likely to be misinformation that we can figure out, where we can figure out whether it's true or false. So that can take a lot of different forms. I think in the past it was usually, we were mostly focused on politics, sometimes the economy, sometimes immigration, like the topics that are central to Norwegian public debate. But over the last couple of years, we have focused more on foreign affairs and specifically on areas that are in some kind of crisis. So we have done a lot of work on imagery and video from the war in the Ukraine, and now also in Gaza and the broader Middle East. And that has also led to some additions and changes to our methodology. So normally when we fact-checked information a couple of years back, we would try to find authoritative sources, we tried to look at research, we interviewed experts like a lot of the people who are present in this room, or domain experts of various stripes, just to try to figure out what is the most plausible explanation of something. So usually we would see something like, there are now 1 million illegal immigrants in Norway, and we're like, okay, who will have some knowledge about this? It's clearly false, but we need some evidence, and then you would just go to where the evidence is likely to be. But now I think the content stream that we're encountering has become a lot more diverse, and this is not just because of the way the internet has evolved, but also the way our focus has evolved over time. So now we are looking at a lot of satellite imagery, for example, to figure out. So the most common way that you get misinformation about foreign affairs and especially about war, is that people take video or images that are from some other war and claim that it is from the current one. Usually in order to make one side look incompetent or extraordinarily violent or something like that. So you need to trace the original context of the image. And there have been studies of this done by Google, for example, that the most common form of visual misinformation is out of context imagery. So we've not really seen AI-generated imagery to a large extent. That's mostly, in our experience, used to create memes. So images that people can rally around and that sort of reflects their take on a situation or on an event. So a typical example would be an AI-generated image that we encountered last year of a Palestinian boy and an Israeli girl holding hands and just obviously being the best friends you could possibly imagine, but also very clearly an AI-generated image that didn't really purport to represent something out there in the world that would be important for our understanding of the events of the conflict, but just sort of an emotional thing. So we can note that this is AI-generated, but there's not really that much more to it. It doesn't make a claim about what the world is like. So mostly it's old or out of context imagery, and then they usually claim to be from a specific place or depict a specific event. So what we need to do then is, okay, when could this have happened? If it's a real event, and then you can go find images on social media. You can actually use images from satellite services to try to pinpoint, okay, it must have been here. Do we see any trace of the purported event in the evidence that we have collected? And very often the answer is no. Sometimes it's yes. So we've tried to create a map where you can see the events that we have verified through this method, so that you can get at least a sense of like what kind of videos and images you can actually trust from, say, the Middle East, for example. So in this process, there are several ways we use AI. So we can use that both for this type of verification work, but also for more ordinary investigative journalism and just in our day-to-day work. So mostly AI is used in the media industry as a way to increase productivity. And I think the biggest productivity boost, and I would expect some of the people here to have experienced this boost as well, is from transcription models, like OpenAI's Whisper. Everyone knows that transcribing interviews is very tedious and takes up a lot of time. But when you can get like 90% of the work done automatically, you free up a lot more time to do serious journalism or to do serious research. So that's one of the biggest things we've experienced. But we also use AI for image classification, for example. So we have, together with Media Futures at the University of Bergen, we developed a model that can identify armored vehicles, which is quite useful when you're looking at footage from, or images from armed conflict. Because one way of identifying if the image is from the context it purports to be is to see, well, is the armored vehicle here actually something that the militaries in the region have? And if the answer is no, then you can sort of dismiss the image, which makes the process, that's much easier to do if you have a model that has about 85% accuracy than if you don't. So that's one thing we do. We also have other ways of interpreting images, geolocation, and so on. So we're starting to create more automated systems for exploring imagery especially, but also for looking at things like large amounts of video from TikTok, for example, that we can transcribe automatically, classify, and do all sorts of analysis on. So really for us, AI has been a huge boost, not in fact-checking politicians like we normally did, but definitely in looking at social media and also verifying images, for example. So for us, it's been definitely more good than bad. And we I think, like authoritarian regimes, we also like computer vision very much.
I mean, I like it how you put a positive spin to my starting point, which was, okay, today we look at the misuse of AI. But, and you also mentioned something really interesting, which I want to return to later, which is emotions, and how often these sort of AI-generated images or out-of-context imagery kind of triggers emotions in you know, the receiving end.
So I think one thing I want to emphasize before we move on is that one thing we've seen surprisingly little of, and I know we will return to this topic later, is disinformation campaigns and influence campaigns from hostile foreign actors. So that's not been a big part of our work. We've seen some homegrown actors, not naming any names right now, but I think some of you can imagine who we're talking about here, that sort of they disseminate Russian narratives, for example, but we have not seen any direct influence that have had an impact on the part of the public sphere that we're looking at.
This is really interesting. I will return to this afterwards. But, okay, so we started with a kind of background perspective, if you will, in terms of authoritarian, perhaps not just regimes, but actors or illiberal actors more in generally, and why they use AI tools to spread disinformation. And then we got a little bit more practical with your work from Faktisk. I wanted now to, with Christopher, perhaps zoom out a little bit again and ask you, from your perspective as somebody who works on ethics and law, what are the implications of these trends for how we perhaps rethink the role of ethics in our societies, and how does it relate to artificial intelligence tools?
That's a wonderful and big question, and I'll get into it through debate, which is on the misuse of ethics. So I think that brings in some realism into this field. So a lot of the debate, there's a lot of important initiatives for regulating AI at different levels, and in Europe you have the EU AI Act, and still most of the decision making that has deep ethical implications when it comes to big tech companies and their also role when their platforms are used in Myanmar, for instance, or other settings, is relying on self-regulation. And as we heard yesterday, there has been invested a lot in ethics guidance, in ethics boards, councils, advisory boards, trust and safety advisors, etc., to maintain this and take responsibility. Still, when I meet practitioners discussing ethics, they're often very skeptical to this debate on ethics and to what extent ethics can actually address or be the solution to this problem. And this is because they see it as an inefficient alternative to either political engagement and oversight, where the whole citizenry really engages in this and have an opinion and push their politicians, or legal regulation, proper legal regulation where people are held accountable. So this has resulted in a critique of so-called ethics washing, where the use of ethics for self-regulation is associated with things like ethics shopping, which is to shop the principles that fit what the companies already do. And with this vast amount of different principles and guidances out there that Branka Panic mentioned yesterday, there's a lot to shop from. So the companies take responsibility to the extent that it does not actually conflict with their business model. So that's one criticism. A related criticism is what's called ethics lobbying, which is that their commitment to ethics is used to keep legal regulation and political oversight at an arm's length. So that this is used very actively to, in an unethical way, hinder regulation. There's also Luciano Floridi, who's just published a book on ethics of artificial intelligence, but has worked in this field for many years. And this comes out of collaborations that he has had with a larger environment. So Josh Coles is one of his collaborators who actually came up with some of these concepts. has also brought to the table the concept of ethics dumping, which is also already an established concept from the EU, that is about companies taking things that are seen as ethically problematic in a European or a US setting. They introduce and experiment with it abroad, and then they import what works eventually. So that's ethics dumping. And then finally, ethics shirking, which is that as you reduce the investment in ethics when it's possible. So you operate in a country where you don't have journalists looking into how the technology is working. So not many are able to actually hold the company accountable, and then they just illegitimately, instead of taking that very responsibly, they just avoid investing in it because they don't have to. It's skulking in Norwegian. This has led to what someone called Elettra Bietti has called ethics bashing, which is the kind of common assumption that ethics doesn't work. Ethics can't solve this problem. We have to go political or go into legal responses, which is very unfortunate because also the argument for going political and legal is an ethical argument. So this has resulted in a lot of confusion, and we can come back to that later.
Yeah, thank you. I think you raised very interesting points, and something that I've been discussing previously with some colleagues is also that some of the private companies I've been talking to throughout the years, and I should clarify these were most in the military domain, but I suppose you can find examples also in the civilian domain. Sometimes they do see potential ethical regulations or forthcoming ethical regulations as a way to actually know what will come for them down the line. So there maybe is also a more positive approach for some that want regulations, because then they know which kind of technologies will or will not be allowed to develop in the future. I wanted to add a further layer to this, which is, people in the street, people that are not in this room, that do not work with these issues every day, and how do they deal with disinformation, fake news, generative AI content? Because one thing is, we have all these instruments, and this is great, but how do we get them across? How do we get people that are checking the news online and either don't know that there are fact-checking tools that they can use, or they can't be bothered. So, then they forward you the link and they say, so I've read this, right? So how do we get the message across to the common person? The question is for all of you, but I guess maybe Morten is...
I'll try to answer that. So unfortunately, I think we know based on what we know from surveys, I think there are some surveys with slightly questionable methodology in this area, in Norway, including in Norway. So a lot of it is self-reporting, like how much disinformation have you encountered in the past year, which is like, okay, maybe if the disinformation was effective, you wouldn't be able to identify it as such.
Exactly.
But there are other ways of figuring out how good people are at critically evaluating the information they encounter. And I think the results are not super depressing, but also not very... There's not a lot of reason for optimism either, so basically neutral. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like, if we sort of zoom in on AI-generated misinformation or AI-generated content, it does not appear to be something that people have trouble dealing with as of now. So in Norway, the instances we have seen where AI-generated imagery has been problematic has actually been failures on part of the media. So I think the most prominent, also kind of funny example was in the spring when it was snowing in the southern part of Norway, and the local office of NRK, the national public broadcaster, asked people to submit their images of the snowstorm, and an image was submitted that showed a woman holding a snowball in the middle of Kristiansand. And the problem with that, so they published this image. The problem was that it had been generated by AI. And it was actually quite apparent, so I imagine that things had been moving very quickly in the newsroom. which is understandable but also very embarrassing. But that's really the most prominent example we have seen of someone being fooled by AI-generated images in a way that has some actual consequences, in this case for NRK's reputation. So that was quite problematic. But otherwise, there hasn't been a lot of this in Norway. And when we look to other countries like the US, the main form of AI-generated imagery and content that is spreading there is what's called Facebook AI slop, which is like weird images of kids made of Coca-Cola cans, like that kind of thing. That is obviously AI-generated and probably just a source of entertainment. So it's not problematic for at least for the information ecosystem that this stuff exists. Like terrible memes and bad images posted by your aunt has always been on social media, and this is just the latest iteration. I think the main worry about how people handle the fact that AI-generated misinformation exists is more of a second-order effect. So recently, the Turing Institute had a report on AI-generated misinformation, especially relating to elections. And they also emphasized this, that what is really, the really troubling consequence is that people might lose trust in the information system as a whole because they know that there is fairly realistic, credible, apparently credible AI-generated content out there, and that could reduce their trust in the entirety of the information ecosystem, including the reliable parts. And that reasoning is supported by a paper that was out in Nature before the summer, which says that if you present people with information about, or claims about how much misinformation there is out there, without being nuanced and without putting it in context, that also tends to reduce trust in information generally. So one thing we're trying to do, and we're working with Media City Bergen and Media Futures also, in something called Project Reiner, which is a project that is trying to label authentic imagery as such and sort of tell you what the provenance of content is, how it was made, how an image was edited, when it was taken, and so on, to sort of increase the, not just the supply, but also the recognizability of credible content that could help people navigate and sort of reduce the second-order bad effects from AI-generated misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about trust, and I'm sure we'll return to this also, but I think, Christopher, you might have a response.
Yeah, just in terms of the awareness of these issues that have to do with implications of digital technologies and AI in authoritarian settings, and to what extent the debates that we have in a very democratic society on legitimate uses and what types of technologies that Norway wants to develop also in various ways may have play out very differently in other political settings. I think this is a discussion that is very welcome, and it's very hard to take those longer implications into account. And also to think about, do we have a responsibility for not using technologies and developing technologies in a democratic setting that will play out in a very different way in Egypt, for instance, or in China, other places, where so one thing is China that develops their own technology, but there are many countries that European countries export technologies to. Also non-democratic countries. You can also think of in between, like Turkey. And should Norwegian citizens be thinking about this, factor it into their attitudes towards these technologies? That's at least a very high demand. And when looking at organizations that start using various tools in their work, the capability also of those that start using them for thinking, in a principled manner about these issues, is so far very limited, and that's also what they self-report. That this is the major hindrance they see for actually being responsible in their uses of new technology and AI, is lacking capacity and competence to actually grapple with this. So that's the first hurdle. And in ethics, there's then been an emphasis on virtue ethics as an approach that has really focused on ethical, moral competence as key to making ethical decisions. So, for instance, Shan Valor has come up with a kind of an alternative to Floridi and the others who come up with universal general principles for AI, focusing instead on the virtues that are necessary and how those are different in different parts of the world. So you also see a tension between a sort of universalist and a more culturally relativist approach to ethics of AI in that discussion.
I think you bring up a really important question, and I know from where you and I sit, technology is not neutral. But and I think what might absolve European countries because of course, as I mentioned, developing countries buy these technologies from Russia, from China, but they also buy it from Europe, as you pointed out. What might absolve, I suppose, European providers as opposed to Chinese or Russian providers is that the surveillance cameras, for example. The Chinese surveillance cameras, they come with training on how to use them. Now, of course, those training programs are imbued with certain norms and values that are very, very distinct from a European company, right? So there's a tension there. I wanted to go back to Carl, perhaps, who I think has a comment on the kind of autocratic regime's perspective.
I think I have 3 comments. I'll try to keep them very brief. Some is just kind of reiterating and adding to some of the comments. So for example, that Morten noted on the results on kind of can we fight misinformation, not being kind of very optimistic, but not being entirely pessimistic either. And I think that's a super summary. Also, my reading of this literature. It is, I think, very plausible to think that some of these things take a lot of time. I mean, you can see this in educational efforts in Norwegian schools, for example. So I have a daughter now in 9th grade, and kind of they have quite a lot of kind of focus on misinformation. So every year there will be kind of a focus on this. It takes time to develop this kind of knowledge, and also norms for kind of checking information, kind of if it's super embarrassing to spread information, not only for media outlets, but also for kind of my father, or kind of if I say, well, this is probably misinformation, you shouldn't have put that on your Facebook page. Sorry to my father if he's if he's watching. I think these things take time, and there are some kind of on the educational side, so we shouldn't expect, because it's so hard, right? So these are strategically manipulated messages. They're constructed in a manner so they should be hard to identify that they're fake, right? But we can learn and adapt, at least as a collective, and people talk with each other, right? And the norms of kind of pointing out that this is not a good thing to do. You should be more cautious checking. And one of the findings that I found most intriguing was by Josh Tucker and several other colleagues at NYU, showing that there might be a generational difference. I know that these results have been contested, but this also speaks to the long term. So younger people being somewhat better at detecting misinformation than older generations. Even if kind of no one is particularly good at detecting misinformation, but there's that study indicates a difference. That speaks to perhaps the importance of kind of growing up and being accustomed to kind of these tactics and norms for looking at it. But second, very quick point related to, I think, exactly this point that in autocratic regimes, that also more generally you see this in democracies as well. Sometimes kind of it's not necessarily kind of misinformation on a topic that's very kind of, if there's a contested topic out there in the political space. What is often the most effective strategy is just to flood the information space with lots and lots of irrelevant information. The Chinese are super good at this, for example, so just distracting people by throwing out a lot of information. So that's a very effective strategy, and that's hard to fight, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, definitely China, who is a relatively newer actor in this, in terms of online influence operation, takes a lot from the Russian playbook in terms of like just spreading chaos, basically. But so I want to pick up on this, and also something that Morten said earlier about often what we see, at least in Norway, is not so much the direct involvement by these sort of state actors, but perhaps domestic actors kind of parroting, the Russian propaganda or the Chinese propaganda, what have you. So then my question is, based on the rate of success of these online disinformation campaigns, based on what we know, and the kind of tension between direct or indirect involvement, what is the aim? So from on the one hand, Russia, I mean, we know it is directly involved in a lot of influence campaigns throughout Europe and in the US. What does Russia want to achieve? And then the second layer of the question is, what does the domestic actor parroting Russian propaganda or Chinese propaganda want to achieve? You can go first.
Yeah, I mean, so these are kind of some of the more, again, going back to what is more constant about politics and more kind of less context dependent. I think it's often about influence and power for these domestic actors. It's often about achieving political positions or bolstering their regime. It could be other very specific goals as well. It could be kind of promoting some kind of policy, or for some kind of spreading chaos and bringing down the system. That's also motivation to some. But I think so in that sense, you might have kind of unholy alliances between the kind of actors who would want to achieve something domestically and, let's say, a Russia who would want to see chaos in what they view as a potential enemy. I mean, if you could flip a potential neutral state becoming an ally as well, I mean, achieving international influence, kind of weakening potential enemies and obtaining new allies. So in that sense, you might see some very strange ideological constellations, right? So Russia kind of then working in concert with, or at least informally collaborating with both kind of extreme left groups and extreme right groups, because the goals are objective, but they go in line with, they achieve the same kind of different goals by collaborating.
Can say something, but I think this is going to be mostly speculative. It's just from what we can observe here in our journalistic work. But what we're seeing is, I think, mirrors fairly closely what you're saying as well, Karl-Henrik. So in Norway, for example, the actors that are parroting Russian narratives to the highest degree are either extremely far left, so something like Pål Steigan, for example, the former leader of the AKP party, who visited Pol Pot back in the 70s, for example. He is now definitely the prime purveyor of Russian propaganda to a sort of wider Norwegian public. But it's also the most far-right established party, like the Norges Demokratene. So these are strange bedfellows, but I think the pattern that you can see in countries like Germany, for example, with the Sarah Wagenknecht party and the AFD, is mirrored in Norway as well, although not inside of the mainstream party system. So that's definitely a thing. So some kind of, I wouldn't call it political opportunism, but it's fringe actors using whatever talking points can bolster their narrative about Norway and about geopolitics and so on. I think that's fairly typical. And then, yeah, I think you have also just pure opportunists who use the fact of the ability to be as contrarian as possible as a way of gaining online influence and building clout. I think that's also a pretty important factor. And we've seen that over the years, not just when it comes to foreign misinformation, but also misinformation about immigration and about any polarized topic. So that's pretty typical too.
Yeah, I think for somebody like, again, myself, who works on the kind of more geopolitical movements or dynamics, this is reflected also at that level, because what we see these days is exactly what you said about the kind of different constellations of somewhat odd friends, really, that get together just to spread chaos or that happen to have overlapping interests on certain issues, right? I wonder if Christopher has a contribution on this.
So on a higher level of abstraction, there is also sort of an alignment that Shoshana Zuboff also points to in her work on surveillance capitalism, between a certain technocratic idea purveying some of the post-humanist or the kind of singularity ideas in Silicon Valley, and a Chinese kind of vision of a centrally steered technocracy. So they don't like each other, but they both hold something which is somewhat undemocratic as an approach to politics. Like the technology can fix things that democracy cannot. And Yuval Harari points to this in his previous work, Homo Deus, as well, in terms of a dataist vision as an alternative to humanist visions, and where the humanist is putting emphasis in the role of the human in a democracy. If the data and the capacity to govern efficiently is the objective, then you don't necessarily need all those humans autonomous as part of that process. So there's an alignment of interests there that is interesting in terms of also the debates on how do you interpret the principles of AI, like justice, that it should be benevolent and so on. These mean very different things if you're a humanist or so-called trans or post-humanist.
I think what worries me perhaps mostly is, because in democratic societies, of course, we are having these conversations. In China and Russia, well, I guess to an extent they're hopeless. But again, what worries me is what about other, middle countries and countries that, as Branka Panic was pointing out yesterday, conflicts tend to happen more and more in middle-income countries that have introduced some measures of democracy. So what worries me is how do all these overlapping, interconnected issues pan out in countries where there is no space for having these conversations to begin with. I have one more question for you, actually, on a somewhat related topic that I get asked myself when I speak about China's use of AI tools domestically and abroad, which is, does education have a role in this? As in, is it realistic to embed, ethical thinking, moral, philosophical thinking in school curricula, university curricula? Is education, can it be a vehicle for sort of channeling these very higher up meta-level conversations that we're having in this room through society?
So I think it's the only way to addressing these issues in the long term. Question is whether we have time to wait for those effects. So a Swedish philosopher, Torbjörn Tännsjö, just published a book on how there's a need for a transitional global autocracy to tackle also the problem of AI that could eventually turn democratic. But in his view, we don't have time for letting education on these issues trickle into people's mindsets as a long-term investment. In the absence of that solution, I think focusing on education, the role of education in this is just fundamental, because you can't rely on politicians also in democratic societies to really take responsible choices, decisions, unless the people expect them to.
Morten and then Carl.
Yeah, so two things. I'm not sure if I completely agree with the time frame here. So in Norwegian school curricula, there has been quite a bit of focus on misinformation and critical thinking about the information you consume for quite a few years now. And we also have an educational division, TENK, which creates free for use educational materials for the schools to use. And I think probably your daughter has encountered these at some point in her education. So it's already there. I think the second thing is, at least based on the psychological research I've seen so there is a team of researchers from MIT and Cornell who do research on what kinds of cognitive features or cognitive capabilities distinguish between those who are able to identify false information and fake news and those who don't. And the main characteristic that they have identified is critical thinking and analytical sophistication. So I think what you would intuitively expect to boost people's resilience against misinformation is exactly what does it, according to this research. And strengthening critical thinking seems to be much easier to implement in schools than something very specific that has you sort of counter each type of misinformation as you go. So I'm actually quite optimistic about the role of schools and education in this area.
Was that a two-finger that you have, Christopher? Sorry.
No, if you have something.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll try to follow directly up. I also think kind of 2 points. So one is that you can pursue multiple instruments at the same time, right? So it's not an either or. So you can pursue the educational track, and maybe some of the effects are more shorter term. Another one, if it's related to building norms and so on, they could be longer term effects. So I think I'm also kind of fairly optimistic on the role of education, but I think we should be realistic in terms of not expecting too strong effects either. This is an inherently hard problem to solve, and then my take would be it's important not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we can kind of do something here on the margins and increase awareness and the ability to detect, that's great. We should do it. It's a relatively cheap intervention. It probably also kind of raises more broader civic awareness. But on this point then of not expecting too strong effects, so one thing is kind of the cognitive ability to detect and so on. There's a really interesting study by Michael Bang-Pedersen from Aarhus and colleagues on kind of what they call the need for chaos, kind of building on psychological research, but then looking into the politics side of it. So there is this notion of kind of a certain kind of several individuals having this kind of seeing the system burn, so to speak, or kind of bringing everything to the ground, kind of what they call the need for chaos. It's often kind of related then to, let's say, the Trump voters who kind of really detest the political system in the US, and this is done on US individuals. That's a subset of citizens in different countries. It's not necessarily super large, but it turns out that these citizens are kind of, so even if they detect misinformation, they would be kind of willing, according to some experimental studies, then to actually continue spreading it. I mean, so one thing is actually detecting it, but it might be difficult to cleanse the system entirely of misinformation. It might serve different purposes.
Yeah, so in terms of the time perspective, if we speak about fact-checking misinformation, it's quite easy to communicate and discuss within kind of the parameters that people are currently already aware of. And then there are these existential long-term effects of AI, which also leading scholars in that field really are still trying to grapple with. And those issues are not currently present in the educational system. And the question is, how can we make sure that societies are prepared for actually dealing with this? And I'm not speaking kind of a utopia necessarily, or a dystopia, but of just the qualities that people need to deal with a completely different technological environment. So in this debate, the role of the education system is one thing, but you also have the role of political leaders in non-democratic countries and how you can get those on board in these efforts at regulating AI. It's also too easy to make a very stark distinction between the interests that democratic and non-democratic countries have in this field. So trying to identify the potential alliances in the regulating it in the short term is also important.
So that line of argument actually worries me a little because, of course, you can think about the existential risks from AI and the long-term risks from AI, but the scenarios that you can imagine when you start thinking along those lines are extremely diverse. So actually locking in a specific approach, I'm not trying to cast you as a defender of the Tensho-style autocracy, but even so, like moving very strongly in a specific direction, you might also miss the true scenario that's developing, which might have worse consequences than working on the margins. So I think, if we last year had started making huge interventions to counter what we then thought of as the potential for sort of industrial scale deployment of AI-generated misinformation, we would have missed the mark because that's not what we have been seeing. So this technology is very unpredictable, and I think it's then very dangerous to sort of go for very strong interventions to try to mitigate what we now think is the most likely bad outcome.
Last comment from the panel, and then I want to open up.
Okay, wonderful. So I fully agree, and it speaks also to the problem of how we speak of AI in general, and it's turned into kind of a monster or a god. It's turned into something very intangible. And it's a shorthand for a lot of different practices and technologies. So it's a bit similar to how we talked about globalization as something that we thought we agreed on what we discussed, but we overrated it in common, but didn't understand each other when we talked about it. So I think there are certain. So your point on being precise about scenarios, being precise about exactly what we are discussing is very important in this respect.
Yeah, I think it's a point well taken, and that speaks to the kind of broader issue with AI tools. In many ways, we we don't really know what the effects will be, right, on for some technologies. And just to very briefly bring it back to one of the themes for the panel, this year 50 plus something countries were holding elections. There was a high expectation that many of these elections will be or could be affected in some ways or another by disinformation. We don't quite know yet, right? So I guess also it will take some other years perhaps to really see and examine the trends also from this year and building on the past. Okay, very, very brief.
Very briefly. Yeah, because one thing is kind of maybe not observing kind of, let's say, deepfake videos to the extent that we might have expected maybe 1 year ago. But remember that the potential consequences of kind of tilting one election, so kind of an effective video or two for a couple of days during an election campaign can have a lot of effects. So there's also this point is worth keeping in mind. And I'm also, when it comes to these kinds of videos, especially election scenarios, we're kind of cleaning things up. You have kind of short-term effects are also really important. This is where I think those are especially relevant.
Martin,
I can try to be very brief. So, yeah, but the thing about the elections is I agree that the short-term consequences could translate into very big long-term consequences. But the expectation this year was that we would see deepfake videos and deepfake audios in at least some of the countries participating in the European elections, and there wasn't anything. We didn't observe anything. And the instances that have been observed, there you've seen that the AI-generated content usually is only spread by other automated accounts. So it's sort of like a closed system. And I think that makes me much more optimistic about these types of scenarios than I would have been 6 months ago.
Good. I like how you're always optimistic about this.
Someone has to be.
Yeah, for sure. I could continue this conversation for a very long time, but I want to save the last 5 minutes for questions from the audience. So if we could, I see one here at the front. Please briefly introduce yourself and then your question.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Malaga. I work at conflictforecast.org from Econ AI. So my question is, maybe there are some things that we want to protect, democracy, and they are kind of fragile, and we are finding that they are fragile. And maybe it's not about only deep fake images or fake news, or sometimes it just can be polarization exacerbating by us because of the reach of opinions, the fast reach of just opinions without facts. And sometimes it can be very difficult to contest all those opinions. So have you thinking about it, how to regulate it? Should we regulate it? Maybe we don't know what's going to happen, but we really know what we don't want to happen. And maybe we can protect at least this very, I don't know, the education of young people and democracies. There are some non-negotiables. Have you thought about it? That will be.
Thank you. If there are any other questions, I can take one more. Yes, Dylan, here at the center.
Hi, I'm Dylan. I'm a machine learning engineer on the Views project. So my question has to do with the role of surveillance and AI. So, like you guys mentioned earlier, in authoritarian governments, right? It is much easier to see the consequences of mass surveillance and the role of AI. But this kind of profiling and targeting is more than capable of happening in a perfect democracy as well, right? It's just that the people living under authoritarian regimes are more aware of the abuse of power that they face. But this could easily happen, like right here as well. So now my question is, how, since people aren't directly aware of the consequences of this, how do we get them to shift their opinion to actually demand more privacy and more legislation in this respect? Because the common response that you get is because it's that, since I have nothing to hide, I don't need to worry about it. But, since you're under a democratic government, you don't really need to worry about it until you do. So how do we get people to focus on something like this?
Thank you, Dylan. You have two very difficult but yet somewhat related questions on like perhaps if I could summarize them, where does the responsibility lie in a way? Maybe we can start with Christopher and go this way, and you have, 3 minutes to answer.
Yes, so I think this question that you bring up is a deeply democratic political question. So we need the public to truly care and be informed about it. So you could imagine that we put together a group of experts looking into it and giving advice to politicians. But this is a fundamental democratic conversation that we need to have in society more broadly. And I think it's perfect how you put it. And in terms of exactly to what extent should you take into account the potential authoritarian future in a democracy when you introduce something which is unproblematic or even really beneficial in a democratic setting, but that can be turned once you get into a different political order? That's a very tricky choice to make, whether to avoid using it in the short term just because of this potential abuse in the future. You can try to build that into, and there are many discussions on how to build that limitation into the technology as a matter of design.
Morten.
Okay, so these were fairly complicated questions. I want to start with your question about the spread of opinion on platforms like social media, for example. And to me, that's still the fundamental problem within information now, or the fundamental question. So the people's ability to distribute information and get their opinions and their content out to huge audiences has changed, just been completely transformed over the last decade. And the thing is, we have seen some worrying consequences of that development or that revolution, but I don't think we know very much about the actual consequences it has had. We don't know about its effect on the public sphere in Norway. We don't know its effect on the global public sphere. And so it's just an incredibly thorny problem, and one that I don't think we have. We don't know what the problem really is, and we also don't know what the solution is. So I think this is much more worrying to me than AI-generated misinformation, for example. So the second question about privacy, here I'm worried, and I think as a part of the media sector, I'm especially worried. So because it doesn't seem like the average citizen values his or her privacy very highly. And I think a good example is the law that was passed a couple of years ago that enables the intelligence services in Norway to collect web traffic that crosses the border. Now, what amount of web traffic does not cross the border? Very, very little. And this means, they can only access that if they have a court ruling to the effect that they're allowed to. But it does mean that a lot of data, for example, communications between journalists and sources, are likely to be, at least the metadata from that communication is likely to be stored on a server accessible to the intelligence services, which is deeply troubling. So I think there was very little resistance to this law being passed. I think actually a majority supported it, and most people didn't care. So this tells me that because privacy in the digital age is very abstract, people don't really know how to value it, or they don't value it very highly. So I think this is a very deep problem for us.
Karl-Henrik, you get the last word on this.
Yeah, so a lot of good points have already been taken. So I'll add a couple of new ones. So I also worry about the polarization aspects too, and the threats to democracy. So one thing is kind of the uncertain effects on how kind of the social media landscape is structured on kind of wider polarization. I know that there's a lot of interesting work going on looking into how different algorithms kind of contribute to kind of bridging different users of social media platforms and looking into effects on polarization and access to different pieces of news. So a lot of work on kind of regulating algorithms could be interesting. But then on the downstream effects of polarization on democracy, that's also something that's really worrying. So there's a lot of interesting experimental work going on kind of when do voters want to kind of punish politicians who engage in anti-democratic behavior. And that is key, right? Because if I'm a politician and I can kind of violate democratic norms or principles and my voters will still keep on voting for me, then it's so much easier to do that. And one of the things that correlates with that kind of low willingness to punish politicians is high degree of polarization. If there's a long distance from me politically to the opposing political party, I won't vote for that party regardless of how my own candidate behaves. So I'm also worried about the effects of polarization on the resilience of democracies. So I think I'll stop there. Well, maybe one thing. So democracies tend to react to scandals. I think that there's something about this being kind of not a high priority issue, but whenever there's a scandal, this is when these things pop up. So I think kind of using, there might be opportunities for having more thorough discussions involving more actors than just the intelligence services and a few very interested people if there are things appearing. Other than that, pointing to kind of horror scenarios such as George Orwell's 1984 or China's kind of credit system. I think that's also something that's really vivid and can help bring up a debate on the potential risks. Yeah, but read 1984. I guess that's the...
Thank you so much. We're ending almost on time. There are many takeaways from this panel. It's impossible for me to summarize everything, but perhaps I can highlight the level of uncertainty that we have about the effects of many of these AI tools that will require a holistic approach that involves really everyone in society. That's the second point. And the third, related, also the urgency that we have in dealing with these problems that are very present and that need to have, everybody needs to care about these problems in order for us to be able to find solutions. So thank you very much again. We, of course, have focused in this panel on civilian applications of AI, but the next panel in about 10 minutes will talk about the military applications of AI. So there's now a 10 minutes break, and then we'll see you again at 10:15. But please first join me in a round of applause for the panel.
I'm Greg Reichberg, research professor at PRIO. The topic of our panel right now is governing military AI. And before launching into the topic, I'd first like to introduce our two panelists. So we have Sigrid Redse Johansen here. And for several years now, she has been Judge Advocate General for the Norwegian Armed Forces, a function that has recently been incorporated into the Director of Public Prosecution's office. She also works as Special Advisor in Law for the Norwegian Special Operations Command, and she's an Associate Professor and Lecturer in International and Operational Law at the Norwegian Defense Command and Staff College. She has fairly recently published a book, The Military Commander's Necessity, The Law of Armed Conflict and Its Limits. And then I have Lily Pinjenberg Muller. Did I get your middle name? Pronounce it.
Almost.
What was it?
Pijnberg.
Pijnberg, okay. Lily Muller. She's a lecturer. I'm just simplifying, you know. She's a lecturer in war studies at King's College London. Her research focuses on emerging technology and changing security practices, and recently the role of technology in the development of AI in security practices. Right? She's an interdisciplinary researcher in critical security studies and science and technology studies. Okay, so governing military AI. Why is it that we've ended up talking about governance issues in relation to military uses of AI? And a lot of this interest in the topic and agitation around the topic comes from discourses that have been underway for, well, somewhere like 14 years around the concept of autonomous weapon systems. So, and I dipped into the history behind this term autonomous weapon systems, and it's kind of a curious one, because in a way, automated systems have been around for quite a long time in the military sphere. I mean, you know, goes at least back to the First World War, when something called a Kittering bug was devised. This was a tiny unmanned airplane with preset controls that could plunge to the ground as a bomb. But the main developments came in the 1970s with the engineering of defensive ground and ship defenses. And these systems were designed to perform their own search, detect, evaluation, track, engage, and kill assessment functions to defend ships and in particular areas against fast-moving and highly maneuverable threats. They didn't use the term autonomous to describe these systems. They spoke rather in terms of, well, like automatic special and so forth. But they could be, once an engagement decision was made, these systems would identify and engage with targets without there being a human being in that specific loop. I spoke with an admiral who ran an Aegis system, was in charge of an Aegis system on a U.S. vessel, and he said when he got in conversation with his fellow admirals, he said they never wanted to put that onto automatic special. That was really scary. That sense that you were not fully in control of what was happening. But anyway, if we just scroll, forward in time, the debate really heated up in 2012 when two things happened. First, Human Rights Watch published a report, Losing Humanity, the Case Against Killer Robots. And it was accompanied by a press release, Ban Killer Robots Before It's Too Late. All right, and the focus was on the protection of civilians. The worry that these new systems would somehow sidestep the necessary discrimination between civilians and military personnel. But the same year, interestingly, and I don't know whether there's any connection, the U.S. issued a policy document called Directive 3000.09, which mandated a special review process to minimize the probability and consequences of failure in autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon systems. And the whole idea behind this directive was that autonomous and semi-autonomous systems would have to go through a stringent review process, a review process more stringent than those that ordinary weapon systems are placed within. That was in 2012. I had a word with some folks in the US military, and I said, well, how many systems have been put through Directive 3000.09 review? How many journal articles, or what's the number of readers of a typical journal article? Usually like 0, you know? Well, that's the number of systems that have, at least publicly, been put through that review process, which is quite interesting and striking. Okay. Once these two initiatives happened, there's been a really broad discussion, and I've said enough in my introductory comments. It has gotten to the point, well, we'll just have to mention, the UN in Geneva has led, there have been rather wide-ranging discussions about whether autonomous weapon systems ought to be banned. And that discussion became very philosophical. In fact, philosophers were involved, and became a huge issue just how to define the unit of analysis. What is an autonomous weapon systems? And the whole discussions really became bogged down in these definitional issues. All right, so that's sort of how the discussion got underway. And it's reached a point where some actors, for instance, the United Kingdom, in their strategy document on use of AI technologies in the military sphere, they just omit mention of autonomous weapon systems. Right? So I'd sort of like to ask as a first question, whether, in speaking about military uses of AI, and I mean military uses right now, I'm not talking about it within the field of logistics. I'm speaking about weapon platforms. Specifically, do you think that autonomous weapon systems, that label, provides us with the right unit of analysis? Maybe Sigrid?
Well, yes and no. And for a starter, the limitation that you made before asking the question, that you were not talking about logistics, and that's in a way one of the reasons why I think that the discussion has taken perhaps too much space upon laws, lethal autonomous weapon system, and not enough on the other functions that you actually use autonomous functions or AI. Because at least from a Norwegian perspective, advanced technology, to put it in a very broad term, AI or autonomy, is critical for the Norwegian military, and it's not for the weapon system itself. So that's one for a starter, where it perhaps is. It's not the term is not perhaps unhelpful in itself, but it in a way it takes too much attention in some aspects from the other fields that you were very limiting from. So that's one aspect, and the other one is the obvious one that you were touching upon, the definitorial aspect. First, for the autonomy, because I spoke to one. I'm a lawyer, so I'm not a technologist, but when I have cooperated with technologists, one said laconically that to me, he said, what we label autonomous seems to evolve according to what we understand. So what we don't understand, we label autonomous, and when we understand it, we push the limit a bit further, and we say that it's automated. So, which means that it's a fluctual term. and that it's the concept that it entails is also somewhat fluid. So that's a challenge. And the other one is the aspect of weapon system, because what is it? I mean, the weapon system can consist of the trigger, the weapon, a handheld weapon, which is quite simple, but it can also consist of an air system with the multiple sensors talking together, and then it's more difficult to in a way to sort out what the weapon system is. And from my perspective, how to regulate it, how to govern it, and then you get obsessed with the definitional issue instead of the real topic.
Okay, thanks. Lily?
No, I think that's such a great point about how it's always evolving. When you know what it is, we keep pushing the boundaries. And I think, just like what you said, Greg, that we are this obsession about defining what is autonomous and not kind of detaches the discussion from what's actually going on in the field. And it's the same now with AIs being added on top to create this confusion, right? And I often think from my research that this obsession with defining, I mean, as a legal scholar, you have to also define the topic, but it's also this private sector influence of like saying like this is something else now that we can't define to kind of get around the legal field. So I definitely think that this, instead of talking about what it is or is not, talking about that it is about targeting, detecting, and doing that without human intervention. And that's what we're really discussing. And exactly your point from the Second World War, even the First World War II today. It's been happening, and we keep pushing the boundary to then kind of avoid touching upon what we're really discussing, which is like the use of technology in war.
I mean, the curious thing to me, at least, is the automated systems that were in use all the way beginning in the 70s up through, to the present. In air defense systems, for example, were hardly viewed as problematic. I mean, if you start digging into the literature, you find very few legal discussions about special challenges, and very little on the ethics front also. So, to my mind, somehow the introduction of the word autonomous seems to have galvanized, ethical concern. But maybe just following up on what you said, Lily, could we try to not define, because we want to avoid defining, but could we just try to specify within weapon platforms, what are some of the different AI-related functions? Do we get a sense of the range?
Yeah, I don't know if I can't define all the different types of AI being used by the military. Obviously, that's a hard thing as a scholar outside of the military to even like get access to. But we know that they're using machine learning technology. And I think that's more about, we heard about that at the previous panel as well. It's collecting data and how do you digest that data. And right now, the US military and the Norwegian military are using a lot of the Palantir software, for example, where you know that a lot of data is being collected. And it's about, like, at least in my study, I try to understand how that data is being collected and how it's being sorted through and what kind of information that leads to and how the military operates. But yeah, I think you can.
Yeah, well, no, it's the same. Of course, you can have, like you said, you can have systems that have been labeled automatic for years, which are just in a way very advanced systems that are very quickly able to recognize and then to target. So they recognize the certain parameters that they're supposed to target, and then they target it. So that's the easiest way to approach, that. And then there is, of course, the data collection issue, and I think that's perhaps one of the most practical aspects: how to deal with the data collection or systematize data collection. How to when the system itself is, for example, self-learning, that it creates its own ways to, for example, navigate, which is practical. When do we need control? Where do we think it's okay? So this is one area, of course, then that well, I mean, to the military, one issue is to cope with big data sets, And the other one, of course, is to be able to have a low signature, not to be there, so that the system itself can operate and collect data and systemize and share it with the rest of part of the system without being interfering with the system's modus, because then you'll be traced by your enemy. So that's another aspect where it's important. And of course, the third is to be able, the one that you to be there, to be present in a hostile environment. So, and to report back without being noticed. So, I mean, different areas of where these advanced systems can function, and then comes the how do we control it? Where are the dangers? Second or first.
But in your work with the Norwegian military, do you see any interest in platforms that can not just identify possible targets, but also engage with the targets? Do you see any move towards developing that kind of technology?
First, I'm now a part of the prosecution, so I'm concerned with the responsibilities and accountability issues. So I do not give advice to the militaries. But what I have experienced then is that, in a way, I think it's very important to keep track of the needs of the military, which are clearly present. To have awareness upon where the challenges arise. And then not to be naive in where the real problems arise. And sometimes I think that the focus is, in a way, too much on the last part of the use of a weapon system. Because what I learned, I think, very early is that it's very simple to put a weapon on a system. It's very simple to put an explosive ordnance on a system. The problem is before that. And you can put an explosive ordnance on almost everything, which is not even very advanced. So, but let me also be very clear that, of course, in the military, there is, like you refer to the admiral, I have never seen a great willingness from the military to take on systems that they can't control. I mean, quite the opposite. More reluctance than you would imagine is what I have seen, actually. Because they like to know what they're dealing with, like the rest of us. And they want to be certain how to calculate their effects. And if they don't understand the system, it's very difficult to calculate effects. So that's one thing. And for in a way, the use is, I think that one of the most important areas of use for Norway is what has been stipulated out in public documents as well, is because we have a vast sea territory and an environment which can be hostile, where it's very, very important to have a low signature. So to be able to save lives, to be present without being present, in a way. That's, in a way, the major area. And then I think that to put weapon on it has been a kind of a secondary issue so far. And then I think it's important not to be naive. It's easy to put weapons on, but to put the weapon on has not been, in a way, what I'm seeing, the first priority of the system.
Yeah, Lily?
I just think very interesting the point you made about, like, for you it's important to understand what the military needs, and I'm very curious as to if you also, like, your reflections on how you understand what the military needs, because from my research and perspective, I find it extremely fascinating how, like, tracking how the old, like, Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, has been so important in informing how the military needs AI, right? And Peter Thiel with Palantir, and OpenAI with Sam Altman. These characters from Silicon Valley are so infiltrated, and like Eric Schmidt wrote this book with Henry Kissinger about the age of AI for the military, right? These private sector people are infiltrating into, and also, like, we had the same with, like, I think Dick Clark from the US military also wrote one of the books, like, I think 10 years ago, 2012. How long ago is that now? Like, cyber war is coming, you know. There's this huge push that suddenly everyone had to care about cyber war, and now it's AI. And it's the same thing that we are kind of discussing. Like, this panel is about, like, how do we govern military use of AI? But who's actually saying that the military needs all this AI? Like, why does the military need it, except from your... So I feel like there's, like, a public discussion that we're having and we're interested, and then what actually the military is using isn't always overlapping, and we're crossing each other in these discussions.
I'm glad you bring that up. I read an interview with Alex Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir. He, by the way, has a PhD in philosophy. I was provoked by some of his comments in that interview because he doesn't speak much in terms of autonomous weapon systems. He prefers the expression algorithmic warfare, which is somehow this whole nexus between, command and control, communications, speed up the tempo. So the interviewer asked him about, what the ethical issues might be within this domain. And he gets very bombastic and defensive and says, U.S.'s adversaries, he always speaks our adversaries, they don't care about ethics. So are we going to leave ourselves defenseless? So it's like, and this is someone who is running a company that apparently is delivering systems to the U.S. military. And I'm thinking to myself, actually, the U.S. military has standards for the adoption of weapon systems, all right? I don't know if they're bound by Article 36, but but they de facto follow it, because they didn't sign on to the the Geneva, what is it? Additional protocol. Yeah, okay. But they follow it. So it's like there's a disjunct between the discourse that some of these folks engage in and what the actual practices that are in place. I mean, I spoke with the CEO of Kongsberg Defense, Eric Lee, and he said, before you can bring a new product, military defense product like an air defense system to market, you need to, there's at least 10 years of testing, right? So I'm like, what sort of testing are they doing at Palantir? Have they found a way to sidestep it? I just don't know. But the discourse is troublesome, in my opinion. But again, if we come back to this idea of autonomous weapon systems, there's a strange kind of paradox. Paradox, yeah, in the literature. Some people lift up the idea of autonomy in weapon systems as a way to show how it's inherently wrong, right? So they try to make it sound like you've got these a kind of human-like creature out there that's going to be making its own decisions and going to be armed, the killer robot image. And they say this is really bad because we can't have non-human decisions being made in the battlefield. That should rest only in the hands of human beings. This is a matter of human respect. Okay, so on the one hand, this is trying to show how inherently wrong it is. Then you get the other group, like Alex Karp types, who are talking up autonomy because they want to sell this stuff. So they're saying, let's say you're doing a remotely controlled drone targeted assassination. It's not enough just to have one guy sitting in that room, controlling the drone. There's like a whole group of people in the room, and these are highly skilled people. Okay, that's expensive. So you can go to the military and say, I got a cost saving solution to this. Automate it, so you're not going to have this group of highly trained, expensive people sitting in a room and multiplying it. So all right. So this leads me to the question: within this field of weaponized AI, and I'm construing that broadly to include not only the final moment of target engagement, but also the AI and decision support. Okay, and as we've already seen, that can cover quite a few things. What do you think are the main, let's call them ethical problems that emerge in this field? and and I want to say also legal problems, but ideally, I think the law should reflect our views about what's right and wrong, ethics. So if you just say, where do you see the main problems in this?
Well, first you have referred to the Article 36, and I don't know if everyone are familiar with what we mean when we refer to Article 36. So it's the Article 36 of the additional protocol to the Fourth Geneva Convention, which places a duty upon states to assess whether new methods or means of warfare, including then autonomous weapon systems, will be in conformity with the law when you apply them. So it's a legal assessment duty, which is placed upon states, and it arises already from the study, development, and production. So at a very early stage, you're supposed to assess the legality of the system or the method that you're taking into use as a state. So this means at each time when the state is taking on board new technology or new ways of using that technology, for example, pairing old weapon systems with new technology, they have to assess whether this would be lawful. And in this, of course, then there is the human. And we have a great faith. I think what I have seen, if I speak in the legal ethical landscape, I completely agree with you. The law has to reflect our ethical aspirations. And I think that we have, there is very deeply inside of us, we have a great faith in human. Although we do so many mistakes as human beings, and perhaps we do much more mistakes than machines, but we have a great faith in human being. And I think as a layperson, I think that we have a kind of tendency to forgive humans much more than machines. So we expect more from the machine than from the human being because it's a machine. So, and the machine as well is not blinded by the fog of war as the commander is. So then someone will say that would be an advocate for the system, but then on the other hand, the system doesn't have empathy. So he will not resign. He will just go on with his task. And of course, in here lies both the opportunities and the challenges when governing this use under the Article 36. So saying this, of course, the legal framework governing attack decisions, which is placed in the law of armed conflict, it presumes a human being. It has all these flexible norms. What is a military advantage? That's a human decision. What is excessive civilian collateral damage? That's a human decision. So they have all these flexible, very discretionary thresholds that the commander has to live up to. And it's clear that these are human decisions. The question is, where does the human have to be in loop? How can he or she use this advanced weaponry as a support tool, of course? And I am then, of course, very much obsessed with the accountability and responsibility. Where does it lie? On how much do we demand from our commanders, in a way? And since this obligation to assess the legality of the system arises already at the stage of the study of this system, not only the production and the use, I think it's very, very important to involve the users throughout in the study. So since we presume that there should be a human in loop with its fault and deficits and everything, the human need to be able to take control simply of the system at the critical points. It's very easily said and it's very difficult to do. But the human need to know their system. And that's back to your admiral when you referred to. I have heard similar stories that you can have advanced functions in the militaries that only one person know how to use. And that's scary. Because you can't have a system that has been developed detached from the users. Yeah. So I think that because in the other end of the scale where I work, when you place responsibility, you presume that the commander knows his or her assets, what are the tools that are available to me during this operation, and what are their minimum function, how do they function in a way. So they need to be able to task the system properly. I think that's very, very critical. So through the testing, validation, development process, I think it's critical to have the commander on board, basically.
That's a great overview.
Yeah.
Thanks. Lily, any follow-up to this idea of what aspects of, the range of AI functions within weapon systems, what you think could be problematic?
Tons of things.
Well, let's hear. Come with it.
I love your point about that we should have more empathy for technology. I think that's just great. Also, because the technology never has empathy for us, like you also said. So it's a very interesting, more like philosophical tangent. But I think that's an interesting question. I'd love to talk more about. But yeah, I think what we keep going into this discussion about, like, you know, where's the human in the loop, and then we have this image of killer robots. And I think for me, one of the most like dangerous, or not, the things that are worrying to me is that we keep then pushing where the human needs to be, and we're talking about the or the data being collected that these decisions are being made on, like the software is collecting all this data. We don't really know where the data is coming from, you know, but it's creating the decision basis for how these decisions are being made. But we don't think about that as somewhere where ethics has to intervene, because it's just like this boring, dry data collection, right? But it's at the end, at the shooter, like you said, that's where we have to like have an ethical intervention. But I think it's important to actually move away from that back to that boring, really dry data, the methodologies that are being used by the military that informs how these decisions are being made. So yeah, I want to push away from the image of the killer robot and the human being in or out the loop. Like, it's in every step, and specifically here where that data is being created that informs these decisions, where we have to move the debate and the legal interventions as well.
And then it comes to empathy of the. I don't think necessarily you should have empathy for the system, but it's clear that the system does not have empathy, and I think that one of the mistakes that we do, because we are humans, is that we attribute human characteristics to the system. We talk about robots and we see some kind of human-like figure, which can possess human-like attributes, but they don't. And I think that's in a way both alienates it and scares us more. We should be scared, but perhaps not for that.
Exactly. It's like the data that we should be scared of.
There was a book that appeared some years ago. I don't recall the name of the author. Weapons of Math Destruction. Yeah. Math, you know, like mathematics, because all the like bad ways that statistics can be used in governing decision making. So I mean, it's important that you flag this in the context of AI's use in military operations, including targeting decisions. I think that there was a report put out by I think it's the United States Special Operations University. Interesting that they should have a university, but anyway,
very special.
Yeah, I'm sure. Anyway, the report was entitled "Big Data for Generals and Everyone Over 40." And the thrust of the report, it was very readable, and the thrust of the report was that to make use of big data, which is increasingly becoming the case in military operations, you need to know how to be a wise user of that data. And they said that's no simple matter. And they said it's very easy to fall into this idea that you've got a dashboard and you just press that dashboard and you get your answer. And they said because it's never that simple. The report underlines in lots of different ways. First of all, when you're putting a question to the system, and if you put that question wrongly when you press that button, well, you're going to get the wrong answer. You're not going to get the answer to what you really wanted to know. And there's a really big, problem area when it comes to automation bias. Just thinking that the machine knows best. So now, but you've got the opposite problem, which is lack of trust in a system. There was a famous incident where an Aegis battleship system shot down an Iranian airliner. I think it was in 1988. It's called the vessel is called the Vincennes, and it wasn't shot down in automated mode. There was a commander who made the decision. They thought that this airliner. They thought that was a incoming military aircraft or a missile. They weren't sure. Apparently, the system gave them the correct indications. But for some reason, and it's a complicated story, they didn't want to listen. They didn't listen to the indications the system was giving. So that's the opposite problem. So there's really an issue of finding, the golden mean in these matters between trusting too much and trusting too little. And there was a book that I have read and really benefited from by an author named Nancy Levison. And the title is Engineering Safety. And she makes the really good point that today's systems are complex. They involve a lot of many use of automation at different levels. And she said that when problems arise, it's so easy to say the human operator was at fault. And she said, but unfortunately, because this doesn't help, legal determinations of responsibility, she said, often the system was set up badly. And so that's, I think, speaks to your point, Sigrid, that you've got the whole sort of review, which really looks to the ethical values that are involved, that has to start at the very beginning when you design the system. Otherwise, when human beings start to exercise what they think is their proper mode of control, they may mess things up because somehow the system was arranged that in such ways that certain kinds of interventions will be counterproductive. But anyway, you were going to say.
Yeah, sure. I think I absolutely agree. And so that's also why I say that it's very important to have like the commander, to put it easy speaking, on board when you have this development phase. That because they are usually, like you said, that they are generals and people over 40. I mean, they are normal persons that are not especially trained to understand these systems. So they can be like the Vincennes incident, that they in a way trust themselves more than the data they get because I like to see it. It's a bit like this, or the other way around, that they say that the system is usually right, and it usually is if it's set up correct. So they are human beings like everyone else. But the point is that again, the accountability system afterwards will judge them perhaps harder. Because it's so dangerous. I mean, this is the sharpest tool that we have as a state, is the military. So we expect it to be zero fault when you take it into use. You don't want false mistakes from these kind of systems. So you need a very, very high level of testing before you take it into attack mode, if that's the issue.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question. I didn't alert you to this question before our little prep chat. But there's one of the worries when it comes to the use of AI systems in the military domain is the introduction of autonomous functions is going to creep far and higher and higher upwards in the military chain of decision making. And the reason it's going to creep higher and higher up is that these interactions are happening at increasingly high speed. And so it's going to be, the more you get machines involved, it's going to, and the reaction times are reduced. This is already the case in cyber operations, right? It's going to be harder and harder for a human agent to keep in that decision-making loop because of the speed. So they're saying that we're going to end up delegating more and more functions to the machines, up to the point where we're going to end up handing over strategic decisions to the machines. And Palantir, they've developed the system that they're selling, which is a kind of strategy advisor for command. So what is this something we should be worried about? This handing over more and more decision making, handing over more and more functions higher and higher up into the command structure. Is this something like you're worried about?
Well, I'm definitely worried about that. Obviously, I think everyone is, but comes back to...
Can I just say?
Yeah.
I'm not sure we should be real worried about it because of the nature of strategic decision making. So I really I can come back with that maybe in a minute. But come on, come with your
setting me up for failure here.
No. But
I am definitely worried about that as I look at what that decision is being made on and how high it creeps up. But again, for me, that comes back to the discussion of that's like Palantir's selling pitch of what they're doing, and you look at their videos and stuff, and then versus how is it actually being used. Like when I researched how cybersecurity companies, where this, what we now call AI machine learning, is being used is still at a very basic level. So I'd be more interested also in what you think about, like, is it where you see it and where that legal discussion is actually in the military today versus this, like, again, buying the private sector narrative versus practice discussion.
Well, I can't answer for the military, but I think that to your question, it's a very much depends answer. I think because and you can use AI to anything. I have a son, 14 years old, who uses ChatGPT to absolutely anything, to draw things, to answer reports, and I think that if you're growing up today, you need to be able to use these kind of functions properly. So, and if on a strategic level in the military planning process, you want AI functions to assist you to formulate the commander's intent, I don't really see a problem with that as a point of departure. But if you ask a ChatGPT function to say, give me a target set, I think it would be very alarming. So it's it depends very much what you use this system for. And you need to, I think also it's very, very important to have like minimum skills for using this kind of system. Like, again, my son asked the ChatGPT to draw him a weapon shield, and then he was displeased with the drawing that he got, and he yelled at the machine, and you shall draw me this. And then the machine, he still had all these swords in the weapon shield, and after 10 replies back to the machine with all this kind of yelling, I said to him, you need to ask the machine not to draw a weapon shield, because he can't take the weapons out, because his task is to draw a weapon shield. So of course the task, as you said, was wrong. And to have this kind of skills in demanding things from the machine, I think is very, very crucial.
The reason I have a doubt about this is I've just read an article, and the article maintains that strategic decision making cannot be done on the basis of induction. Okay, so it's a different kind of. It involves induction, but at the end of the day, it involves something that the authors refer to it in the philosophical term abduction, which is a kind of a mode of reasoning under situations of uncertainty where there is no right answer. Okay, so they maintain that all of AI as we were just talking about it now, large language models and so forth, that it's all this is all just in induction in very sophisticated ways. Does not take you beyond induction, does not take you into the identification of cause-effect relationship. So they maintain that this idea that we're going to, this idea that the highest levels of decision-making are going to be handed over to a machine, they said, if you tried to do it would fail, you'd end up with a terrible commander. Now, that's not to say some people might be misled and try, and there could be some really negative side effects that come from it. I was in a conversation with some generals. This was a workshop we had in India. These were retired generals. And they said, hey, we in the strategy community, we're really conservative types. We're not handing this over to a machine. So it could be that the worry that this is going to happen is exaggerated. So I think it may be time to hear your thoughts. So just please, Simon.
That mic should adjust. There you go. All right. So sorry if this gets slightly weird, right? But you and me, Greg, we can talk about weird stuff sometimes. So throughout the history of warfare, there's been, a continuous development about using technology to move yourself away from the person you're trying to kill. You could have made an argument a couple of thousand years ago that having a bow is extremely moral, because then you don't have to look the person in the eye that you're trying to stab, and you remove yourself. You could go further and say, well, a crossbow, you don't even need to train to use a crossbow. That's super immoral. You can just start firing. And then at some point, people started using chemical weapons. And that was apparently too effective, so we started regularizing it. But I cannot help to kind of see that this is a discussion, and you already touched at this at the beginning, that has been had before, where are we trying to just sanitize war? So when we see technologies that are a bit too efficient, we're like, oh no, because we would still like to have the opportunity to go into some kind of just war. We still want to have parameters within where we can think we can fight a war. So this goes back to when Obama had his red line in Syria, that there are apparently ways you can kill civilians that are worse than other ways of killing civilians, which is an argument to be made, but it's also a bit weirdly abstract because killing civilians is killing civilians. And I just feel like this is next time we have this discussion, right? It could have been had with chemical weapons. It could have been had with all kind of stuff. So maybe, especially in a Peace Research Institute, this is also maybe, and I'm asking this time for us to once again ask the question, does it make sense to try to sanitize war? And I'm not saying that just wars couldn't exist, but there is a difference between saying, well, a war can be justified, and then trying to sanitize wars in general and saying there exists some kind of ideal version of wars where we only kill the right people, and that's okay. I don't know.
I hear you. I think I'm going to see whether my fellow panelists would like to come over. I have a thought about this, but I'll just see whether you'd like to.
I have also discussed these questions a number of times, and of course you're pointing out the aspects of warfare which are irreconcilable. I mean, why is one death worse than another death? And of course it is lawful to decide to attack, knowing that civilians will lose their lives. That's lawful. So, but then you put a limit somewhere. So, and when it comes to law, which then again should reflect the ethics behind it, it's in a way it's some kind of I don't know if it's acceptance, but at least it's a minimum set of governance. So of course you are saying that we have some limitations. They're not perfect and they're not coherent at all times because you have weapon prohibitions, for example, on explosive bullets and on chemical weapons and on gas, which makes all this kind of weaponry unlawful. But it's lawful to use a grenade, and it can cause exactly the same damage. So it's incoherent. I have had this question so many times from cadets in the military, saying, "Why is this unlawful? I can use a hand grenade, and it blows the arm off." So this is the way it is. So and it's the best we have managed in a way. So it's a kind of human endeavor. The thing of the archer, of course, in the Middle Ages, it was this kind of argument that it made you distant from the. So it's a human inclination. So as a human being, I think that we should try. That's in a way my conviction. It is, but there is one thing in common with these prohibitions, or at least, or two at least. One is that we have throughout history tried to forbid effects that are uncontrollable, and that's one common denominator. For example, for gas and for chemical weapons. It's very, very difficult to control the effects, either for long-term or geographical widespread. We want to prohibit it. So that's to control. That's one thing, and that also I think affects the autonomy discussion because if you talk about self-learning systems, the controlling of effects is I think very present concern. So there I think we have a reason to try. Yeah.
Lily, any?
I'm on your side on this, so I'm just gonna I'll pass the word on. I don't have to repeat it. Yeah.
If I just say quickly, I think the worry behind your question is whether the sanitization of war will make going to war more likely. Okay. Because if it's rendered less bloody, decision makers will more easily opt for this means, in contrast to others. So, I just want to flag that issue. I'm not going to come with an answer to it here. Christopher, yeah. There was another back here apparently sooner. Yeah, I didn't see.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm a research assistant here at PRIO. I would like to ask the panelists on a question on whether, we're talking about autonomous weapons, AI, on weapon system and whatnot. I think there's an aspect that what are you comparing? What's the opposite side, right? So I think in this case it would be typically a human, either in the decision-making loop, or if we're talking about killer robot or uncrewed systems, a human pulling the trigger or a human pressing the button, shooting out a missile. And I would just like to ask if a system, hypothetically, has the Geneva Convention baked into it that follows, maybe not to the perfect extent, but tend to follow the laws of engagement or international humanitarian law, would you trust to encounter such system as a civilian in a combat situation or as a combatant? Or do you rather to face a human on the other side of such a combat situation? Because in my opinion, humans tend to commit war crimes, whereas an autonomous system with certain characteristics baked into it may make decisions that a typical human would not, or a atypical human that may commit war crime would not. So yes, that would be my question.
I mean, that's one of the arguments in favor of autonomous weapon systems. All right, so you'll end up with fewer war crimes. You'll end up with decisions will be made apart from the sort of the passions that personnel face when they're in the battlefield. Fear, even hatred. You're not going to, those sort of unruly passions are going to be taken out of the equation. So, but I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add?
Well, yes, I can to this last part when it comes to war crimes, because it's interesting that you bring it up, because most of the war crimes that have been brought to justice throughout history has not been bombing campaigns. Of course, it has not been those kind. I mean, that's a novelty now that that the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for these Russian leaders suspected of committing war crimes during attack decisions. That's a true novelty. So earlier war crimes have been atrocities on another kind. It's been molesting of prisoners, persons under your custody. So it's not been machine-like war crimes at all. And that's, of course, it takes a human to molest another human. And I don't think machines has a very prominent role in these kind of crimes. So, and when it comes to attack decisions, of course, very often you have whether it's a machine or a human being on the other end is very difficult to say for the persons who are attacked, because if it's, for example, use of artillery, it's an area weapon which goes in a ballistic curve and it hits anywhere. I mean, it's a terrible disaster to be somewhere in the other end, and I think that it's a very simple, rudimentary weapon which hits hard. And I mean, machine or human is sort of irrelevant on the other end there. Yeah.
Christopher, yeah.
Thanks a lot for great discussions. In the work of Floridi, who I mentioned in the previous panel, he argues that the main difference with artificial intelligence is not that it's intelligent or that it's artificial, but that it's a different form of agency, and it changes also human agency when you use it. So I know this is a long-standing insight in the field of science and technology studies that you've worked on, Lily. So I wondered if that's something that you could sort of help us out thinking about. But also when we think about concrete military decision-making, for instance, when you have AI-based target selection systems in Gaza, how does the use of them, even if a human is in control and responsible officially, how does it potentially change the morality of the decisions involved? And Greg, you're an expert in also the distinction between preventive and preemptive warfare or strikes. And if you have a system that really gives reliable information on an upcoming attack in the longer future, but the AI-based system is really reliable, could militaries then use that to argue this is not a preventive but a purely preemptive attack that would somehow be lawful?
Lily, would you like to take a stab at the first part?
Yeah, I just would also please answer the preemptive versus preventive question, because I think that's very interesting with the 2 minutes we have left. I will in 1 minute talk about the whole change of agency in human machine. We can talk about later. It's what my book is about, of the shift of agency. And I think that gets to the previous question I was asked as well, and what I've been trying to say throughout this panel. It's about the data, how the AI is informing us shifts our agency, right? We're not just like, it's not human and it's not machine. We become not, you could use the word cyborgs, not in the way that we have this image in our head from movies, but it's about how we're working together. I think that's your point as well. And that's what's shifting, that we're not talking about either this machine that's fully informed by the Geneva Conventions and all this law, or a totally rational human, but these things come together, and what's shifting and not is the philosophical debate that I would love to have with everyone after this panel. But yeah, I'm also really interested in this preemptive, preventive question. So.
Well, my intention was not to really answer that much about the preemptive and preventive. I think that what you bring up now is both scary and very important and very difficult to answer, also when it comes to human enhancement, not only AI, but human enhancement discussion, which we haven't touched upon here. But your question, the part of your question which regarded the attack decisions where you rely on AI input into target sets or target decisions. Of course, that's the crucial part where we, in a way, have presumed the human being to be in loop, and how much can they rely on and what are the dangers. Well, as I started off with, I think that the assessment of, in order for an attack to be lawful, it has to create a military advantage. And the assessment of a military advantage is a human assessment. The question is how much you can rely on technical support or as decision support from a machine. And of course, an obvious danger, without knowing the intricacies of that system, the obvious danger is that a machine offers you much more advantages than you have even thought of. I think that's a very immediate danger with a system like that. And of course, a very crucial distinction has to be made on, which also the ICRC makes very important, is that the differences between attack decisions concerning humans and machines. Because machines, military objectives which are military by nature, such as tanks and vehicles and airplanes and vessels, much more easy to, of course, they can be automated very easily. The big discussion part concerns human beings, and not only pinpointed human beings, but also when they belong to an armed force. How can you identify all this kind of identification and recognition issues becomes very acute.
If I could just add we're a minute over, but I question whether this is a realistic scenario that you're proposing, because knowing whether an attack is going to be mounted or not really is about knowing what the adversary, the one mounting attack, has decided to do. And I don't see how an AI system, we human beings, we have trouble knowing what other people have decided to do. Mm-hmm. There are signs of what they might do, but actually knowing with certainty what they're going to do before they've done it, you have to penetrate their decisions. Now, how is an AI going to do that? It can make certain inferences again, but it's not going to be able to determine that with any certainty. So again, this is a sort of flagged worry that may not be as big as it appears at first sight. So listen, our time is up. Thanks very much for engaging in this discussion, and thanks all of you for listening to us and for the good questions.
Okay, welcome to a session on academic writing and AI. What kind of, is there hope or despair on the horizon was the question. This will be an interesting one to answer. Let's just start with some introductions.
I'm Sebastian Schutte, a research professor here at PRIO and co-editor of the Journal of Peace Research together with Gudrun Esby.
And I'm Marit Moe-Price, and I am the managing editor for the other journal at PRIO, Security Dialogue. We should have brought copies of the eminent journals, shouldn't we? But you'll find them out in the reception. And as a managing editor, I'm responsible for the whole kind of peer review process primarily, and that's what I want to talk about today.
And I'm Lynn Niegord. In the context of this panel session, I'm here as an author's editor. So what I do is I help academics write and publish their work. So I'll start. I've asked each of us to have some initial reflections, and I'll just start with an observation that when ChatGPT first came out, my brother says to me right away, "You're going to be out of a job. You'd have no more job. You're going to be like, no, your job is going to end." And I was thinking about that, and I was like, no, my job won't end. But I was actually showing my book to somebody earlier today, because I wrote this book, Writing for Scholars, and I feel like I just revised it just yesterday, and it was actually in 2015. But there was not even a word of AI in here, nothing. And I realized if I were to revise this book now, I'd have to have a whole big thing on it. So I started thinking, okay, will I be out of a job? What does my job actually entail when I help authors? And what's the difference between a human editor and ChatGPT and other kinds of AI interventions? And I started thinking that, well, I'm old enough to see multiple technological revolutions when it comes to writing. And, it always raises a question, what is writing and how do we teach writing? And I remember back when writing was penmanship, right? How well did you write? And then, of course, everybody started doing stuff on typewriters, and I was like, okay, it's not how well you write. It's about, spelling. And then computers came along and started fixing your spelling for you. So they're like, okay, no, it's not about spelling. It's more like, sentence flow. Does it sound good? Can you tell a story? And now ChatGPT is coming and telling a story for you. And so that now a lot of the writing professionals are up in a big, it's a big kerfuffle. We're like, what are we going to do now? Because if it's not about storytelling, then what is it about? And in the first session today, they put the finger on it. It's about more like critical thinking. That's what we're going to have to be thinking about when we are teaching writing. And so I thought I would show you just a very, very short example, and some of you have seen this before, of what I mean by this, of the difference between like a human editor and ChatGPT. I guess I'll stand here. So here's an original text of something that, it's a real piece of text. One of my authors, English as a second language, not at PRIO, so I'm not outing anybody here. But it's a couple of sentences. Before treatment, 15 in-depth interviews were conducted, of which 8 with female participants and 7 males, to understand participants' own perspectives of causes of trauma. We chose to conduct in-depth interviews at the outset, as some participants could not feel comfortable expressing themselves in a group until some degree of confidence in the others was established along therapeutic sessions. It's not terrible. It's not great either. And as an editor, normally I'd look at something like this and go, okay. And then I would start trying to fix English. And whereas ChatGPT, with a press of the button, with the command, could you please write this in more idiomatic English, came out with, poof. Prior to treatment, we conducted 15 in-depth interviews to gain insight into the participants' own perspectives on the causes of trauma. Oh, so much easier to read. Of these interviews, 8 involved female participants, 7 involved male participants. We opted to conduct these interviews at the outset because some participants might have felt comfortable expressing themselves in a group setting until a certain level of trust had been established. Right away, you can feel like this is just easier, it's nicer. But is it good enough? Right? The temptation for the author of this would have been like, yes, thank you very much. Press the button, submit. I like it. But when I got to it, I started going, yeah, really? Because a lot of the decisions that you make are not about does it sound good or not, but where do you want to put the emphasis? So here, you had a whole big sentence of these interviews, 8 involved, and then 7 female. You could just, it's not a huge thing. You could just quickly put that in parentheses and not make it a big thing. That's not that concerning. What's more concerning is that it wrote causes of trauma. And ChatGPT just wrote of trauma, but it's not trauma in general, it's of their own trauma. that was the interviews were supposed to be about. ChatGPT could not have known this because it was not in the original. And it's not in the original because they're struggling a bit with their language. And so when I edit, I don't edit just what's there. I also edit with what's not there, because I know the people well enough and I've talked to them enough, and often I have to have long conversations with people to find out what's really in their head. So ChatGPT can't do this for you. So that was one mistake where it was like, okay, that's something that wasn't there in the original and ChatGPT could not possibly know. And again, at the outset, it's not grammatically wrong, but it sort of it missed the point of that it was before the group treatment. That was the issue, not whether it happened at the beginning, but you wanted to happen these individual interviews before the group treatment, right? Again, this is not something that ChatGPT, you can't really blame it for misunderstanding because it wasn't there in the original. And this is a lot of what somebody like me does, is work with authors to help them figure out what it is I'm actually trying to say. So that raises the question then, but at what point does this become cheating? This is really the thing that we're worried about here, and what you guys will be also sort of playing the, coming into. So ChatGPT can't do everything, but what can it do? I mean, if we're going to talk about the hope and despair thing, I am coming out as a cautious optimist here, because for me, I love the fact that it took care of a lot of the English stuff right away. So I could concentrate on the stuff that was more important. For me, what I told to my brother, I said, it just takes care of the soul-sucking parts of my job. But it leaves me with the interesting parts of my job, the parts where we can really talk about, but what is it you're actually trying to say? What matters to you? What's most important? What should we foreground? What should we background? Where do we really want to have the focus here? If you say this, is that a logical conclusion of it? That's the interesting part of what I do. But can we just sort of let people with English as a second, third, fourth language, just let them loose with ChatGPT? I would love to. For me, this would level the playing field in a way that it's just not possible to do right now. Having an editor is incredibly expensive. I can't run around. It just can't be done. This would make it possible for a lot of people to publish in ways that they couldn't before. However, as what you guys have seen right now, it can't do everything for you. So whoever is using it is going to have enough knowledge of English to be able to say, that's not what I meant. Or it sounds good, but that's really not quite right. And already people struggle with arguing with the suggestions that Word makes for you with the grammar. They'll just blindly follow some of those things that, oh, Word says is and not are. And it doesn't always know what the subject of your sentence is, so it's often wrong. And if you can't argue with those grammar suggestions, you ought not to be following them, right? So can people use this if you can't use it without arguing with it? You shouldn't be using it. And also, as I'm sure you'll probably get into as well, Sebastian, we've talked about it's all in how you use the prompts. The prompts make all the difference. And these are not something that you're born knowing how to do. I mean, I'm a complete novice with this thing, and I don't know exactly what to ask it. But just by changing it a little bit, the answers came out quite differently. So learning how to use prompts in a very sophisticated way would make a huge difference. And then we get to a question that we've talked about earlier, where you raised, does that mean the playing field, it's like we've raised the bottom, but we've raised the ceiling more? Right? Yeah, so people's English will be okay, but the people who can use prompts in a very sophisticated way will be even better. So the gap will be maybe not shrunk, but wider. I'm not sure about that. I'm still kind of a cautious optimist, because I do think there are useful ways to use AI. I think obviously helping the grammar is fabulous. If you can engage and argue with it with sending it a draft of your work to say, what do you think are the main points, ChatGPT? And if it comes up with things that you never said, or it missed the main point of what you said, it can be a very, very useful tool. It can be a good way to brainstorm at the beginning. You can have it act as a peer reviewer. You can instruct it to say, be a very pedantic political scientist. What would you pick on with my article right here? You can give it all kinds of identities. So that would be very useful. But when is it cheating? For me, it just comes down to the writer has to be in the driver's seat. It really has to be your work. And this comes down to understanding the nature of academic writing, what it is supposed to be about. Now, we do lots of different kinds of writing as academics. We write a gazillion reports. We talked about report writing earlier, and to be honest, I would be thrilled if we could use AI to help us write a lot of our reports to the Research Council and all those kinds of things. Yes, thank you. Please do that, because there is not an emphasis on originality. It's not the findings of your work. It's not the thoughts in your brain. It's a little bit of box ticking. But good academic writing, here the real emphasis is on original contribution. Original. It means it's got to come from your head. It's got to come from your thoughts. And you have to be in the driver's seat. You have to be the one who's deciding, is this a helpful tool or is it not a helpful tool? And if you're not able to be in that driver's seat, you have no business using it, as far as I'm concerned. Yes, I think that's basically what I'll end on. It can definitely improve what you write, but it can't write for you. So I think with that thought, I will turn it to Marit. I'll just have it resting here for a moment, right, until you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Yes, on the kind of positive versus negative side of AI, I think that my role here today is to kind of come with a word of caution in terms of the use of AI, and in terms of when is it cheating. I can certainly help with that. I can tell you a bit about that. And I thought I should start by saying that artificial intelligence is kind of the undercurrent of what I will be talking about here, and I presume that everybody is familiar with how AI can now generate text and be helpful in that way. So I want to start about 2 years ago, I think, when I was receiving all these kind of submissions to the journal database, which got me quite excited. Oh, we're being noticed in Kazakhstan. Finally, we get lots of submissions from Kazakhstan, and we're getting lots of submissions from China. Finally, after all these years with advertising in China, they've noticed us. And it was great, until I started noticing that something was a little bit off with these submissions. There were certain patterns here that didn't kind of ring true. And I knew this because I've been working with this journal for a long time, and I couldn't pinpoint one specific thing about each of these submissions, but just the number of red flags that in some told me that something was a little bit off here. And upon closer scrutiny, none of these authors were possible to trace. The institutions were non-existent, and I started smelling a rat. So then I started digging a bit deeper, and I discovered that for about 2 years, we had been receiving submissions that had gone underneath the radar, which I hadn't picked up previously. So what are these, and what is happening here? In last year, in 2023, according to an organization called Retraction Watch, which is monitoring academic contributions to journal articles that are being retracted, 10,000 articles were retracted last year. And these articles were retracted for a number of reasons. That could be honest mistakes, it could be plagiarism, or it could be downright cheating. And the majority of these 10,000 submissions from last year were, in fact, what are called fake submissions produced by what is known as troll factories, paper mills. A beloved child has many names. What I want you to understand today, I think, is the scale and the professionalism of this. Because these article factories, paper mills, troll factories, what have you, they are super professional. The submissions we had to our journal, that's just a small sample of what's happening out there in terms of number of submissions. Today, as a researcher, you can go out online. It works like a web shop. You can go out there and you can buy what you want and what your wallet can afford. You can buy a pre-accepted article, an article that's already ready, accepted in a journal, or you can select the topic which is suitable to your professional career or whatever you want. You can choose whether you want to be the sole author, the co-author, the level of the journal you want your article published in. All of this is just down to how much you're willing to pay for it. And the price tag is in the range of $1,000 to $40,000, depending on where you want this article published. So you can see, and what's more, these providers, these troll factories, they guarantee publication. So they're not just taking your money; they guarantee you this article will be published somewhere. And so there's money in this. There's a lot of money. $40,000 for one article, and if you have 5 or 6 authors on that submission. You can see how this is. And if you're going to look at the scale of things again, let's go back to 2013 when Retraction Watch started recording retractions. Then they had 1,000 submissions. In 2022, there were 4,000 retractions. At the end of 2022, entered GTP, and in 2023, you had then 10,000 retractions. And GTP had just arrived. I haven't seen the scales for what's going to happen next, but it's going to be huge, is my prediction to that. And what's more, ChatGPT has just made these fake submissions infinitely better. They're much harder to detect. It's not cut and paste anymore like it was back in the days, the submissions that I found, which were easy to cover. These days, they are much more targeted. These professional factories, they tailor their submissions to the journals. They learn to know the journal. They scope what titles they publish. They make sure that the articles are citing articles that have been published in that journal previously. So it's getting harder and harder to detect. And what's the problem here? Well, you have a customer who's willing to pay for this. Who are these customers? And that's young academics, or not just young academics. There's also more senior academics who just want to kind of boost up their CV or be more successful with their applications and or want to progress in their careers and so on. So we have a massive market here. It's the publish and perish system at its absolute worst here, which these troll factories are feeding on. These are their customers. So what's driving this? And my argument here today is that really the research infrastructure that we've built with the publish and perish system, open access, which is now changing the business model for the publishers. It's now become quantity over quality. That's key for the publishers in terms of making money. And it's forcing the journals to kind of, forcing everyone really to kind of lower the standards. We are creating the perfect storm here for the troll factories to just feed on this and keep feeding us. So why is it then that the quality system that we do have in place does not kind of stop these fake submissions? And there's a number of answers for this, but one thing, as I touched upon here, that the quality is just getting better. And we are under heavier pressure to publish more. And also the reviewers, not least, are under super heavy pressure to carry out essentially free work. And back in the days when I started with this journal, I would send out 4 invites to get 3 reports back. Today, I'm sending out often 10 to 15, even 20 invitations to get 2 reports back. And it goes without saying then that when you had to go so far out in the field there to find reviewers, the reviewers who are reviewing the papers are further detached from the subject matter of the articles and perhaps less capable of catching the mistakes or catching the things that should be caught and so on. So again, we are just kind of diluting the quality of the academic system that we have in place here. And it's deeply concerning to say the least. And adding to this kind of whole artificial intelligence problem here, not just are the articles getting better, but not only is the business model for the publishers changing, but the publishers are also kind of quite keen now to make money on what they have. So with the open access policies that we put in place with the publishing with BBCY license, etc., what we're seeing now is that virtually all publishers are looking into selling out their entire backlog with no consent being sought from the authors. So all academic articles previously published will now be fed into language. What do you call it? The large language model systems, in order to create even better articles. And the question I'm left with then is who's gonna benefit from this? I can just see the kind of the troll factories here rubbing their hands. You know, they are gonna get. This is gonna be trolls on steroids, basically. And I asked GTP what that might look like in the future. And these are the academic trolls just looking forward to feeding more on our system. And I wanted to just end with kind of my last two kind of takeaway points for you to perhaps remember this. And that is, the first point is that the research architecture that we have created with publish and perish in academia, that's on us. And the whole system lends itself to misuse by artificial intelligence. And it's for us, I think, to try and find the answers to how are we going to organize our own kind of research architecture. And the second point I want you to remember is that quality in academic publishing is our best defense. And that goes right into the kind of the journal business, the quality, where we have quality editorial offices who know the journals, who know the content, who know their communities, and where we have a fair system for reviewers who will help us catch what needs to be fixed. And then also to learn to use artificial intelligence in a good and clever way. Artificial intelligence can also be used to detect fraud. But yeah, that's not a story.
Okay. Sebastian?
Yes. So I wanted to start with one important disclaimer. So I'm not representing JPR's official policy on the use of artificial intelligence in scientific publishing. We don't have a journal-specific policy, but our academic publisher and Security Dialogue's academic publisher, Security Dialogue, does have a policy that sort of regulates in basic terms what can and cannot be done, and it, I think that's a very good sign, broadly aligns with your thinking on the matter, Lynn. So, for example, using, say, ChatGPT for language editing is okay, according to them, for as long as the author is in the driver's seat. Using it to generate bulk text with hallucinated, references and all that bad stuff is not okay. They have concerns over copyright violations. So even though the model itself or the providers of these models claim that they have copyright over the training material, common sense will tell you that they don't. So there is a lot of stuff that is being used in violation of, say, very specific licenses, such as CC BY, where you can use it even commercially, but you have to attribute correctly the source, which these models are, of course, technologically incapable of at this point. There's also a concern around plagiarism, because even if you rephrase something, it is always a line that is up for definition to some extent, and interpretation, where sort of the novelty begins, where the plagiarism ends, and what level of attribution is actually warranted for sort of presenting a quote-unquote new idea, which is a riff on an existing one. And there's another point they touch on, which I think is very important, and this is confidentiality. So when you submit your paper to the Journal of Peace Research, we treat it, of course, confidentially with our reviewers. And the reviewers are not supposed to send around the draft. And the reviewers, of course, are not supposed to copy and paste the draft into ChatGPT and have a review auto-generated, because at that point, the paper has gone free range. So we really don't want this, and we can specify it, we can sort of add our 2 cents to this, but this is already anchored in SAGE's AI policy. So this is good, but with regard to the bigger picture, what kind of feelings are induced by the horizon? I think this is a very difficult question. I mean, for once, the horizon is kind of blurry at this point, because we're looking at such rapid technological advancements. And this maybe is another disclaimer worth making here for this discussion. When we talk about AI technologies, large language models, multimodal models, things like this, we're talking about present day. And this talk might not age very well, because what happens in 25, 26, 27 is really anyone's guess. So the horizon is kind of blurry, but it's coming at you at the speed of sound. And it's a situation that generates, I think, understandably, a lot of anxiety. We can look at it in numbers, however, to get a very sort of crude idea. This has been done by Epoch AI, which is a technology think tank. They've released a report in August asking whether or not we would bump into fundamental technological obstacles as we pursue the so-called scaling law. So for the past couple of years, it's been observed that you can have a proportional performance increase in these large language models for the amount of training data you feed in, or parameter size, or compute time, or whatever. So there is a proportional relationship, and this is really crazy, because normally these technologies taper off and plateau rather sooner than later, and this combination of transformer networks, deep learning, massive amounts of data doesn't yield this signature of tapering off. But it might. For example, if we run out of chips, this is one of those fundamental obstacles. Is chip production capability really able to keep up? The answer is yes. For the next 5 years, it is. Is power production capability enough to power these data centers to train? The answer is yes, for the next 5 years. Microsoft has just announced that they're buying small modular nuclear reactors for some of the power centers. I think other data providers are looking into similar technologies. Investments are being made massively into new data centers. And some of them run in the tens and cumulative hundreds of billions of dollars, which is an insane amount of money for like a real physical thing that is being built in the world. And then the question is, will we run out of data? Will we run out of training data? So there's only so much human-written text in the world. Only so much of it is machine readable. And the answer is no, not in the next 5 years. So if you combine these three no's, then you can extrapolate that we're looking at a pretty much guaranteed, baked in, sure to happen, 10,000-fold increase in parameter size or compute or training, effective use of training data in these models, which is equivalent to the jump from GPT-2 to ChatGPT-4. So GPT-2 was a model that could only complete sentences. You would say, my cat has, and then would go on black fur. And this got a very small and obscure community of computational linguists very excited, because I can tell you from my own undergrad training that 20 years ago, this seemed like an impossible dream. People tried to make neural networks produce syntactically correct sentences or semantically meaningful stuff, but never at the same time, and nobody believed it would ever work. So the fact that it worked in whatever, 2018 or something like that, 17 maybe, I don't know. In the ballpark, that was exciting to these specialized communities. But it is such a far cry from ChatGPT-4, which can do all these crazy things, which can summarize text and help you, diagnose problems with your dishwasher and talk to you in 50 different languages and walk you through the obscurities of quantum mechanics and all of this stuff at expert level. So we're looking at a 10,000-fold increase, equivalent from the jump from GPT-2 to ChatGPT-4. This will happen over the next 5 years and then result in a product like ChatGPT-6 or 7. And I don't know what this means in fundamental terms. I have no human intuition for what it is like to jump 10,000-fold from ChatGPT-4. And this, of course, is an important disclaimer as we're looking forward, as we're talking about the future. And it touches on two things you said, Marit. Currently, the AI policies, for example, from SAGE, they kind of leverage this fact that we're still at a qualitative advantage. So if you have the deep expert knowledge, if you know the reviewer networks, if you can really do the very high quality editorial work, you can beat a system that would just riff on existing text and produce sort of canned reviews and decisions and all of this. But this qualitative advantage might not be forever, and the quantitative disadvantage we're at is also baked into the AI policy. Because of confidentiality, you're not allowed as a reviewer to send the paper out to an AI model. Now, if people use these technologies to produce the papers and you're not allowed to leverage technology to match their productivity, of course, you're really putting a strain on the reviewer pool. But we're seeing that this is already being recognized, and the journalists react by manuscript transfers to reduce reviewer overload and things like this. But I think it is fair to say, and it's fair to concede this point to you, Marit, that we are looking at a technological disadvantage in this sort of arms race between fake production and human detection.
So we by the way, at any point you guys can start raising your hands. But just while you guys are thinking about some questions, I was just we were reflecting a little bit on. I think Nick, who couldn't be here today, was talking about the difference between these problems have existed for a long time: falsification of data, plagiarism, blah blah. These are not new things. But as you pointed out, there's a difference between artisanal falsification, which it took an awful lot of effort, to mass production, right? So it's a huge quantitative leap between, you'd almost had to applaud the effort before. It's like, you put a lot of effort into making up that data. You probably could have just saved time by gathering it yourself, right? And now it's like, it's with a touch of a button, you can suddenly have a whole bunch of data that's getting increasingly difficult to spot as being fake. And so we were talking a little bit yesterday, and I realized we don't know the answer to this, but it would be I'm very curious about what you guys think might result in perhaps short-term or interim demands for peer review. And while you're thinking about this, I'm going to tell you a story of something that just happened to me yesterday. Somebody got in touch with me because they heard we were talking about this, and they said, okay, real story happening right now. She had Googled herself, as one does, and found a citation, a brand new citation. She thought, oh, this is lovely. And it was a citation to an article she had not written. So it was already out in a publication, one of these hallucinated articles that somebody either believed or just didn't check. It was not caught by the editor, was not caught by the publisher, and was out there for all the world to see. And she's now completely like, well, what do I do? Do I? Because it looks now that I'm claiming I wrote an article I haven't written. The citation was true. The thing I said was true, but that came from an unpublished report. So ChatGPT had mixed all this stuff together. Unpublished report. Sounds like it ought to have come from this article, so I'll just make it up. And so where does the responsibility lie for something like that? Who's at fault? I think the author was, but beyond that.
The author was at fault for having a false publication under their name out there?
Yeah, well, the author of the chapter, not of the author of the chapter who cited a fake publication. I think that was the person.
That author,
not the one who had Googled herself and found out that she was cited. It's obviously not her fault. She didn't do that on purpose. But the author of the chapter who used it, obviously you think that, in terms of ethics, as an author, you should be responsible. All the stuff that you put in your reference list. And this is one of the things I find interesting, because there's a lot of stuff in between what you should do and what you actually do. And, a lot of us start off with very good intentions, read all the stuff, and then somebody says, you should cite this one. And you're like, oh, I got 5 minutes before I got to submit it. And then you just plop it in your reference list. And maybe you've looked at the abstract, but you haven't really looked into it. So, and it's a slippery slope from there, right? So you start citing things that are cited in something else that you cited, because you want to make sure that you show that there's a root, that the original idea came here. And pretty soon your reference list is populated by things you haven't actually read. That's bad enough. But what if it's populated by things that don't exist?
And this happens. We already know that these troll factories are publishing or sending in articles where they have literally stolen the identity of genuine researchers out there with fake submissions and so on again. So, you can easily see how this would end up being cited and become an urban myth or an academic myth, as it were, for articles that haven't existed. So I'd like to point again to some extent back to kind of the research architecture that we've built here in terms of where it's important for each and every academic that their publication list is accurate and real for promotion purposes and so on. We again need quality here in that process to make sure that whatever an academic has on their list is genuine, and so on. The academic themselves have responsibility to make sure that their CV, of course, is accurate and so on. And then there needs to be an understanding out there in the larger academic community that all this fraud is happening. And the best every individual can do is to keep our own path clean. And when we are publishing articles, we, with due diligence, make sure that our article cites others correctly and truly and fairly. And we're back to quality again. Quality, I think, is the only thing that can beat this.
Yeah. Did you have a thought? Otherwise, I can. Yeah.
Yes. So I think picking up on the artisanal versus machine-generated fraud problem, it is very, very obvious from where I sit that we see the potential for doing fraud at scale with these technologies. But it is also important to have this discussion in reference to the human baseline in other areas. So, for example, when you look at something like scientific knowledge management, something that is supposed to happen within entire research programs, we're supposed to write a whole bunch of papers on the causes of civil war, and we're using certain methods, or we're focusing on certain geographic areas, things like that. In the end of the day, we want the general public, as well as the researchers doing the research, to be able to make sense of the picture that we've generated, one data analysis at a time, one research paper at a time. And the way we do this is we sort of handcraft these literature reviews that are supposed to point to the important papers that have already been written in this area. And literature reviews are not always great, because there is a huge incentive for overselling your own contribution to make it past peer review, to conveniently ignore stuff that doesn't fit the picture, to blow out of proportion something that somebody maybe set as sort of a potential future research avenue, which has now become a puzzle or a pressing scientific question that sort of, needs solving right now. And these biases distort the cumulative picture that we can generate. And they make it more difficult to read the flood of human-generated papers, not machine-generated, but human-generated papers. And this is a problem we just sort of have to live with because of how we do science communication, scientific publishing. Of course, there could be a place for machines that would have to be better than what we have right now, in that they do remember the exact source of whatever they refer to. But of course, there is a huge potential here for having accurate, unbiased, ego-free summaries of research programs written by machines at the exact length you need them. And so not losing sight of these positive possibilities, I think, is important as we're pointing to all the misuse potential as well.
Okay. Summer, you had a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
So my question or my point is more to do with writing, not the coding and other stuff. I think maybe ChatGPT and all these ones are really good at that stuff. I'm just talking about thinking about writing and editing. So I'm from Pakistan, you guys know, and I'm from Global South, and I understand this inequality stuff and this argument. But I don't find it more logical when people talk about because people from, for instance, Pakistan are not good at English, this could level the playing field. I don't think that's the problem. The problem runs very deep. I could not speak good English until I was at the university. And my schooling was from a private school. My mother paid a lot of money. There are structural issues that prevent you from actually speaking good English, and not just speaking good English, like critical mindset. ChatGPT gives you this opportunity of presenting yourself as something smarter than you are. And a dumb person in my past, like past Summer, could actually get away with a lot of things using ChatGPT. I wouldn't be challenged. And I think this is far greater of a danger than people not being able to send their papers to these big journals. And also, like, these policies, I feel like it's so ludicrous, right? It's so stupid. I don't understand, like, how these minds work when you see these journals coming up with these guidelines, like, oh, if you are coding it, just mention ChatGPT, and we're going to rely on AI, you know, those systems which could detect if it's AI generated or not. There was a recent post, somebody found, some model found US Declaration of Independence to be 97% AI generated. I mean, this is where we stand. And where's the resistance against these people? Who's accountable for all these stupid models coming in without watermarks and everything? I think I feel disappointed in terms of how academic journals have, you know, responded to this thing. Not taking care of how would you enforce all these things. So anyway, my whole point was like, are we really looking at other implications? Of course, one thing is, you know, as these legitimizing narratives circulate around us, but also what's the substance in them? That's it.
Okay. Do you guys want to respond first before we go to Christopher, or do you want to hear Christopher's question?
Happy to respond.
Okay, go for
Marit,
it.
do you want to?
Yeah, no, I can just say that I think that you're putting your finger on something important here, but we are in the infancy of artificial intelligence, and I think in the journals and publishers alike are still struggling to understand what this is and how to handle it. There is no common policy, as far as I'm aware, neither between publishers nor between journals in terms of how to handle this. And as a young researcher, I think the risk you're running if you decide to use AI in your academic work before you submit to a journal is that, well, if you've done it, and it's going to be traceable. And if you then try to submit to a journal who has a policy of no AI involvement, then you've got a problem. And I hear you, but it takes time to develop these kind of policies and strategies and figure out what does work and what does not work. We need to understand it ourselves.
Yes, I agree. And the problem you mentioned on enforcement is a very, very big one. So you have sections, for example, in the SAGE AI policy that say, if the editor becomes aware that one of these language models has been used to generate, you know, the paper, then they are entitled to make this grounds for rejection. Well, how? How? So watermarking is theoretically something that could be done on the side of the providers, but they don't really want to. And so the danger here is also that on top of the genuine confusion and also like honestly diverging opinions that might exist among editors and publishers and authors, there's also this danger that if we really clamp down on these technologies now, we're building a massive paper tiger that cannot really bite, because we're just saying, must never use this, can never use this if we catch you, but how? So we, to some extent, also have to work with reality that these technologies are being used. And I think everybody is sort of learning this. If we zoom out a tiny little bit from academic publishing, I know that university lecturers already face this problem. You know, the student paper used to be the gold standard of figuring out whether somebody was really putting in the time and effort, and it's not anymore. I mean, you have to combine it with at least like a verbal mini defense or a multiple choice test or reading comprehension questions about their own text, or you have to get really, really creative to figure out whether a student has done the work. And so I think across all domains where you have written language, cover letters, job applications, all this stuff, everybody will scramble to learn, but it's going to take a while. It's going to be an error-prone process.
And also, just one more thing before I go to Christopher, is that I think one of the things that's making it difficult is that I suspect it's very seldom an either-or situation. It's not like people use ChatGPT to write the entire paper, but that it's like, oh, come on, can I just use it to explain this method? Treat it like Wikipedia and you know, just say, can you write a a brief explanation about the function of a regression. So it's like a few sentences here. They're neutral sentences. I mean, we often see like that's where a lot of the plagiarism happens now. The plagiarism isn't necessarily in the original part, the big idea part, or in the discussion. It's in the background, it's in the literature review, it's in the methods, it's all these places that are considered to be less dangerous. And it's probably, I would suspect, a lot of ChatGPT interference in these areas as well. And the problem with that is not that it's, you know, it is the least important part of the paper, perhaps, but at the same time, it's such a slippery slope. It's such a short way to go from, can you just help me fill in my background section, to, my discussion section sounds a little bit weak. Can you puff it up a little? And then suddenly you're into much more shaky ground.
And that is part of also the big problems as why is AI not necessarily detected, because it is perhaps used for methodology, or it's used to develop a table or an image and so on. It's used in medicine to by these mills to produce fake evidence of clinical trials that have worked and so on. And when this becomes kind of a part of a meta study, it's not the actual article that's submitted, but an article that has used that as literature review or used it as a meta-study and so on, it becomes virtually untraceable. So eventually, you cannot really even rely on a properly conducted article, because you don't know what the basis is. And if artificial intelligence has been used there to generate stuff, it's deeply problematic.
Yeah. Christopher.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I wonder, to go back to what you said, Lynn, in the beginning, the author should remain in the driver's seat. And you just touched upon the difficult lines in terms of exactly what that means. But I'd like to hear some more thoughts on exactly where the line goes between being in the driver's seat and not. And if you're in the driver's seat of a car that is, you know, doing most of the work for you, you know, how much can you take credit for it? So, second, also there's something called EU Living Guidance on the use of AI in research, and it's quite helpful to think about for thinking about this, and then. One of the issues is, or guidances is, use generative AI transparently. And I'll just read from this because I think it's very key. Researchers to be transparent, detail which generative AI tools have been used substantially in their research process. And by substantially, it means, for example, interpreting data analysis, carrying out literature review, identifying research gaps, formulating research aims, developing hypotheses, etc. that could have a substantial impact. Reference to the tool could include the name, version, date, etc., and how it was used and affected the research process. If relevant researchers make the input or prompts and output available in line with open science principles. So this sounds very sensible. But how do you actually do that in practice if you really use it as an integrative tool? And how will I be able to actually assess whether exactly how it's informed my thinking? You know, if I'm just doing it continuously.
Okay, yeah, should we try to answer that? I have a couple of thoughts on that. Part is we don't know yet. I mean, at least as far as I understand where the line goes, because it keeps moving. It used to be fairly easy to see the line because AI couldn't do some of the other things, but now it's suddenly been able to do stuff in a way that it's like, oh, yeah, I don't know. I think this is a really interesting discussion. Like I would have said some time ago, it's not okay to use it in analysis. You know, analysis should be you. But then again, if you're interpreting images, for example, we talked about earlier today, like there's an image of a vehicle, and you know, is this what kind of vehicle is this? If you find that AI is able to more accurately detect what kind of vehicle that is, then maybe that is a case where there's an argument for saying we used AI to detect how many vehicles and what the vehicles were, right? But then the level of interpretation of that would then fall on you. What does that mean, right? That would sort of fall onto you. And we talked the other day about literature reviews, where I actually have I'm very skeptical about using any kind of large language model for literature reviews, because I always see literature reviews as simply a non-neutral thing, where you're always getting a particular angle of it. There's no such thing as saying, can you please, my field is research productivity. I can't imagine saying, can you please review the literature on research productivity? There's way too much. I'd be more like, okay, you'd have to ask a much more specific question, like, how is the research on research productivity changed over the last 10 years? Or what are the clusters of variables that are now in fashion compared to, there's all different ways you can review the same body of literature, depending on what it is you're interested in. And it's not necessarily nefarious. It's not necessarily to ignore some things that are that shouldn't be ignored, but it's because you can't cover the whole world all the time. You are interested in a particular thing. And so therefore you review the literature for that purpose. And as long as ChatGPT can't really quite get the literature system, I mean, it keeps making up literature that doesn't exist. I tried this on my own field, and it talked about existing literature, but it got it completely wrong about what the literature actually says. It managed to pick out one sentence in that article that was in some ways the opposite of what the person meant. They would say 99% of the article was saying A, and then there was a sentence that said not A. And it quoted the not A sentence as saying that was this article was about. And so you would read it and you think, oh yes, this article does exist. It is on this topic, but it completely misrepresented the entire thrust of the article. So I feel like we are long, long, long ways away before trusting ChatGPT with any kind of literature review, personally. But maybe that was a couple months ago. So who knows? Mm-hmm. Do you guys want to respond to that?
Yes, I think this is a very, very central question. Like, where could we even establish a line? And so one practical approach might be to, for example, bounce ideas and research designs and specific questions about research design implementation off of a large language model. This is not plagiarism. It doesn't speak to the concerns that we have about actual text generation, but it is essentially you generating this intellectual echo to your thinking. And from speaking with friends and colleagues about use cases of these large language models, I've developed a little bit of an intuition for where this works and where it doesn't work. Basically, it's still limited to some extent, and that if you have a certain idea, you want to answer this research question, you want to use this method, maybe you have access to this data, how could we get this all together? There's a sort of a cone of possibility in which this conversation could evolve. And even with current technology, this cone has some good stuff in it already. So it might point you to a specific in quantitative analysis, a specific data analysis package that you hadn't heard of. It might suggest problems with certain ways of measuring the impact of this and that on this and that. So there's already good stuff in there, but it is still very much a statistical echo of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say. This might change in the future, with the line becoming a lot more blurry, with these sort of chain of thought or reasoning models such as O1, where you can really start with a very basic prompt and then ask it to iteratively produce everything from more abstract ideas about how to do something to very specific implementations of that something. And I think in that case, this line, which could be very temporary, might actually become extremely blurry. But in terms of limitations right now and the importance of the line, if you worked with a human, as a co-author on the same problem, you would sometimes have the chance of having really beneficial experiences, like the other person telling you, Christopher, I think we're barking up the wrong tree here. We've been talking about this for 15 minutes, and it was great. It was a beautiful discussion. Thank you for that. But it's not going to work. Let's go back to square one. And I've never seen ChatGPT 4.0 or 0.1 do this up to this point. And this is why I'm referring to this as a cone. It is a cone of possible sort of directions this stuff can go into, but it doesn't seem to be jumping back up to square one, telling you, let's try again.
Okay, we have 2 more questions and only a couple minutes left. So hear from Malika first, and then you afterwards.
I'll try to keep it quick. So 1 idea, 2 questions. One, I guess, thing that I was thinking about as far as imagining ChatGPT in the future, and like a question related to that, I feel like it's going to become a lot more ubiquitous, the use of AI. Like already in programming, right? Visual Studio Code always had some kind of a like auto complete my thing, and it wasn't very sophisticated. Now we have Copilot, which oftentimes doesn't get quite the right answer, but it's a good start. And I feel like that's just going to keep pushing. But now they already are thinking about putting it into Excel. So now instead of thinking about how to create something or how to edit rows, you will be able to just say, hey, can you just do this for me? And I'm sure that's going to be coming for things like Word. And once it becomes so ubiquitous where it's just running in the background, you might not even realize that you're using AI, and that's a problem. And my question is, because that was horrifying to hear how many submissions there are, AI does need one extra thing besides just like chips and energy, and that is data and high quality data. But if we have so many bad quality publications out there that then are used to train the AI on, and that creates worse, it just like, what do we do about that? Because that seems like a terrible runaway effect. And question to Lynn is, if we are competing with these very sophisticated mills, can we use AI in this case to help us out? Like ask it like, hey, I have this paper and I need to rewrite it for this particular magazine. Can you, ChatGPT or whatever, tell me what are some things that I should do? Is that a fair use? Is that something that could be essentially creating like an expert knowledge that is not maybe present everywhere?
Are you asking ChatGPT for advice or to write it for you?
No, for advice. Like, I want to publish in, let's say, Nature, Climate. What should be the things I need to cover? What do they like, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to answer that quickly. That's the same as asking a person. Why not? You know, you don't have to follow it as long as you're not copying the text. But before answering the complicated question, I'd like to hear your question because we're kind of out of time. And if we can maybe just wrap up super quick.
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting discussion. Very thought-provoking. And I'm most taken by your observation as a managing editor, that in some sense, and I think this has been going on for many years, the incentive structures have been not quite right. Inclined more towards the pursuit of career rather than maybe the pursuit of truth, if you put it in the loftiest of terms. But that kind of speaks, I suppose, to something very fallible about humans, and especially fallible perhaps about academics in some sense, that we've allowed this structure to be in place for quite a long time. I think anyone who's passed through the system, I'm an associate professor, been around for a while, I've kind of noticed how everyone's very busy producing outputs, and yet when you speak to them when they're honest, they will roll their eyes and think, well, I have to do it. So we've been kind of part of this system for quite a long time. And I suppose that the 3 words that jumped out at me was, ego, originality, these sort of words, and I forget the third one. I still don't quite know what we humans are in this. It could well be that actually they will flush out our fallibility, and in some sense, we're not as good as we think we were in the first place, and many of the so-called clever academics aren't as smart as perhaps they thought they were. And maybe this system, in some sense, will actually be a preferential replacement of, something we have. I don't mean to say I actually really believe this, but I think it could be a chastening experience as much as anything. As these systems unfold.
I'm sorry, but we're actually out of time, but I think we can just wrap up by reflecting on kind of what you're saying and started thinking about not just where are we going in terms of AI, but how are we going to go towards, where are we moving in terms of scholarship and in terms of quality? How will we better know what represents genuine scholarship? So I think we'll just leave with that thought, unless you guys have any other last words you want to say.
I have one immediate reaction to this, and I'm normally the first one who concedes how broken the system is, and today you were the first one. But complaining about sort of the reality of academic publishing and academic career advancement is a little bit like criticizing democracy. It is pretty much always justified because democracy produces suboptimal outcomes left and right. But it's the best system we know of. And we have a paywalled, peer-reviewed, quantity-optimized publication system. But imagining the alternative to that is super hard. And I hope we'll get there. And technology can play a part in it, but getting the incentives right is the really hard part. And I really hope we will be able to improve on it.
Yeah, I'd just like to conclude with it's super complicated. I do not have the answer, but I think the best starting point is really that we need to remove the incentive for the publish and perish system, which means we need to rethink how we're doing research and how we produce research output.
Yeah. Great. Thank you guys so much for coming. And yes, thanks.